On Christmas Eve, in the middle of a Wyoming blizzard, Caleb Rowan stood watching a woman step off the stagecoach, patched coat, battered suitcase, not a dollar to her name. This was the woman he'd agreed to marry? His heart sank. But his 6-year-old daughter Maisie ran straight to her, smiling like she'd known her all her life. One widowed rancher who had forgotten how to let anyone in. One woman who had lost everything except who she was. And one little girl who already understood what her father was too afraid to see. Like, and drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. Don't go anywhere. This is only the beginning. The storm had been coming since mid-morning. Caleb Rowan could feel it in his knees, that deep, grinding ache that never fully went away since the winter 2 years back, when he'd spent 3 days digging fence posts in frozen ground and came home to find Eleanor already gone. Not gone like she'd left. Gone the other kind. The kind you don't come back from. He stood at the window of the main cabin and watched the sky go the color of old pewter, that flat, featureless gray that meant the clouds weren't moving because there was nothing behind them. Just more gray. Wyoming in late December had a particular cruelty to it, not dramatic, not the howling whiteout storms of folklore, but a slow, pressing weight that settled over everything and stayed. Papa. He didn't turn around. Papa, is she coming today? Maisie was 6 years old, and she had her mother's way of asking questions she already knew the answers to. It wasn't a habit she'd learned. It was something she'd been born with, that particular brand of optimism that asked anyway, just to hear the words spoken out loud, as if saying a thing made it more real. Stage comes through at 3, Caleb said. Weather holds, she'll be on it. What if the weather doesn't hold? Then she won't. He heard the small sound Maisie made behind him, not quite a sigh, something more resigned than that, and he turned. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her chin in both hands, staring at the door like she could will it to open. She had Eleanor's dark hair and Eleanor's eyes, and sometimes looking at her was the easiest thing in the world, and sometimes it was the hardest. You don't need to watch the door, he said. I'll go get her. Can I come? No. Why not? Because it's cold, and the road's getting bad, and I'm not dragging you 3 miles to town in a wagon when you can stay here by the fire. Maisie considered this with the gravity of a circuit judge. What if she's scared, she said, coming somewhere she's never been? Wouldn't it be better if she saw a friendly face right away? Caleb looked at his daughter for a long moment. You think your face is friendlier than mine? Maisie didn't hesitate. Yes. He almost smiled. Almost. He pulled his coat from the peg by the door, the heavy one, the one with the worn collar, and shrugged into it. Stay inside, keep the fire. Don't let it get low. I know, Papa. I mean it, Maisie. I know. He left before she could argue further. Look, the road to Harwick was 3 miles of packed dirt that turned to something approaching soup when it rained, and to something approaching iron when it froze hard enough. Today it was somewhere in between, the top layer soft with new snow, and the layer beneath it rutted and treacherous. The horse, an aging gray mare named Biscuit that Eleanor had named when she was Maisie's age and had inherited from her own father, picked her way along the ruts with the careful, joyless precision of an animal that had done this particular journey too many times to pretend it was anything but work. Caleb kept his head down against the wind and tried not to think too much. He'd written the first letter in September. That was almost 4 months ago, though it felt longer. He'd sat at the table for 2 hours before he'd written a single word, and even then he wasn't sure why he was doing it. He told himself it was for Maisie. Maisie needed a woman's influence, needed someone who could teach her things he couldn't, needed something softer than what Caleb could provide on his best days, and considerably worse than that on his worst. That was what he told himself. He didn't examine the other reasons too closely. The matchmaking service, a formal name for what was essentially a woman in Denver who charged $15 and sent letters back and forth between lonely ranchers and women looking for a different kind of life, had sent him 3 possibilities. He'd chosen Evelyn Hart based on her letter, which had been practical, clear-eyed, and free of the kind of elaborate self-promotion that had made the other 2 letters feel like sales pitches. She'd written, I am 31 years old. I was a school teacher for 7 years. I am not afraid of hard work, and I am not given to complaint, though I won't pretend the situation I find myself in is anything other than what it is. I am looking for an honest arrangement with an honest man. If that is what you are offering, I believe we can build something decent together. Something decent. He'd like that. It was the right kind of modest. It didn't promise too much. He'd written back. They'd exchanged 4 letters over 3 months. She was from Ohio, originally, had moved to Missouri after her father's difficulties, had taught school until, she was vague on the particulars here, circumstances had made that impossible to continue. She had no family left that she was in contact with. She was, in her own words, starting with nothing, and she understood that he was offering a home and a life, not a romance. He'd read that last part twice. Then he'd written back and confirmed the arrangements. What he hadn't fully thought through was that confirming the arrangements meant she was actually coming, and now she was. Today. Christmas Eve. He clicked his tongue at Biscuit, and the mare picked up her pace reluctantly, and Caleb stared at the gray sky and wondered, not for the first time, whether he had made a considerable mistake. Harwick wasn't much of a town. It had a general store, a livery, a post office that shared a building with the barber shop, a saloon that smelled of sawdust and old smoke, and a small hotel that served as the stagecoach stop. In summer, it had the energy of a place that believed it might become something eventually. In winter, it mostly just tried to survive. Caleb arrived as the stage was pulling in. He tied Biscuit at the post outside the hotel and stood back as the driver climbed down and the door swung open. 2 men got out first, salesmen by the look of them, coats too fine for the weather, both of them scanning the town with the particular disappointment of people who had been told Wyoming would be scenic. Then a third passenger. Caleb had prepared himself, in an abstract way, for the reality of this moment. He'd told himself that he was a practical man entering a practical arrangement and that appearances were not the measure of a person. He believed that, mostly. But there was a gap between believing something and feeling it, and as Evelyn Hart stepped down from the stage onto the frozen mud of Harwick's main street, Caleb felt the gap open up like a crack in spring ice. She was slight, slighter than he'd imagined, though he'd tried not to imagine anything specific. Her coat was wool, dark blue once, now faded to something closer to gray, and there was a patch on the left elbow that had been done carefully but couldn't be hidden. Her boots were worn at the heel. She carried a single bag, a suitcase of brown leather that had seen considerable use, and she held it with both hands in front of her like she was trying not to let anyone see how heavy it was. She looked around the street with clear, steady eyes, taking stock without giving anything away. And then she saw him. He was the only man standing alone in front of the hotel looking at the stage, so it wasn't difficult. She walked toward him directly, no hesitation, and stopped a few feet away. Up close she was not plain. Her face had a sharpness to it, strong cheekbones, dark eyes that were paying close attention, but she looked tired in a way that went deeper than a long journey. She looked like someone who had been tired for a long time and had simply decided to stop letting it show. "Mr. Rowan," she said. "Miss Hart." She put out her hand and he shook it. Her grip was firm. "I appreciate you coming to meet me," she said. "I wasn't sure given the weather." "Stage came through," he said. "I said I'd be here." She nodded as if this confirmed something she'd been uncertain about. There was a pause. Caleb became aware that he had not said anything welcoming, had not said anything that acknowledged the considerable act of courage it took to get on a stagecoach and travel to a place you'd never been to, marry a man you'd never met. He knew he should say something. He couldn't find the words. "Is it much further?" she asked. "To the ranch?" 3 miles, roads rough." "I don't mind rough roads." He picked up her suitcase before she could protest. It was lighter than he expected, which for some reason made something in his chest feel strange, and led her to the wagon without another word. She climbed up without help and settled herself on the bench, pulling her coat tighter, and he climbed up after her and clicked Biscuit into motion. They rode in silence for a full half-mile before she spoke. "You don't have to pretend this is what you expected," she said. He glanced at her. "Beg your pardon?" "I can see from your face that I'm not what you were imagining." She said it without bitterness, matter of fact, the way you'd report weather. "I'm not offended. I didn't have a picture to send, and letters only tell so much. I just want you to know that I'm aware of it, and I'd rather we be honest with each other than spend the next several weeks being polite around an obvious thing." Caleb kept his eyes on the road. The snow was picking up, small dry flakes now, the kind that didn't amount to much on their own, but that kept coming. I'm not sure what I was imagining, he said, which was mostly true. Something more, she said simply. That's usually the case. He didn't have an answer for that. They rode the rest of the way without speaking, and Caleb stared at the road ahead and tried to figure out what he'd gotten himself into. And Evelyn Hart sat beside him with her worn boots and her careful eyes and looked at the white blanketed land like she was deciding what she thought of it. Maisie heard the wagon before Caleb had even pulled into the yard. She appeared at the door while he was still climbing down from the bench. Hat askew, coat unbuttoned despite his explicit instructions, face alight with the kind of anticipatory excitement that made Caleb simultaneously proud of her and exhausted by her. "Is that her?" Maisie called from the doorway. "Is that Evelyn?" "Get back inside," Caleb said. "It's cold." Maisie did not get back inside. She came down the 2 porch steps in her stocking feet and stood in the snow and stared at the woman sitting on the wagon bench with open, unself-conscious curiosity. Evelyn looked at the child. Something shifted in her expression. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition, like she'd been told there was a little girl, but seeing her made it real in a way the telling hadn't. "You must be Maisie," she said. "I am," Maisie confirmed. "Your boots are worn through at the heel. Doesn't that let the cold in?" "Maisie," Caleb started. "It does," Evelyn said, "but you get used to it." "I could put extra wool in them," Maisie said seriously. "That's what Papa does with his old boots when they get like that. It doesn't fix them, but it helps until you can get new ones." Evelyn climbed down from the wagon. She was the same height as Maisie expected and shorter than she'd imagined an adult would be, and she stood in the snow and looked at this child with the frank, direct gaze of someone genuinely paying attention. "That's a good idea," she said. "I'll try that." Maisie smiled. It was Eleanor's smile, wide and sudden, and it hit Caleb somewhere just below the sternum, the way it always did. "I'm glad you're here," Maisie said. "Papa's been weird all week." "I have not been weird," Caleb said. "You burned the oatmeal twice. That was an accident. You never burn the oatmeal." Maisie looked at Evelyn with the conspiratorial gravity of someone imparting important intelligence. "He's been nervous." "Maisie." "Well, you have been." Evelyn glanced at Caleb. He couldn't quite read her expression. "Let's get inside," she said. "It's cold, and I'd like to see what I'm working with." Washing. The cabin was not large. It had been built by Caleb's father 20 years earlier, expanded once when Eleanor came, expanded a second time when Maisie was born. An additional room tacked onto the back that had always been intended as a children's room, but had been only Maisie's. Always only Maisie's. The main room held the kitchen and the eating table and the fireplace, which was currently doing its job. 2 doors on the back wall led to the bedrooms. Evelyn set her bag down inside the door and looked around the room with those careful eyes. Caleb watched her take it in. He was aware suddenly of all the things he'd stopped seeing. The crack in the plaster above the window, the curtains that needed replacing, the general accumulated evidence of a house that was kept clean but not tended. Eleanor had tended it. After Eleanor, he'd kept it clean because dirty wasn't something he could live with, but tending was something else. Tending was caring about more than function. "It's a good solid cabin," Evelyn said. "It's not much. It's more than I expected." She said it without irony, which made it worse somehow. She walked to the fireplace and held her hands out to the heat, and Caleb noticed that her hands were red from the cold, knuckles cracked in 1 or 2 places. Working hands. Whatever she'd been doing before this, it had not been easy. "Your room's the one on the right," he said. "I'll move my things to the left room." She looked at him over her shoulder. "You don't need to move on my account. It's the bigger room. You should have it." "Mr. Rowan?" "Caleb." A small pause. "Caleb, I am aware that the arrangement we've entered into involves certain expectations, but I think it would be reasonable to take some time before—" "I wasn't suggesting otherwise," he said, more sharply than he intended. "I'm saying the bigger room is yours. That's all I'm saying." She turned back to the fire. "All right," she said. "Thank you." Maisie had been watching this exchange, but from the kitchen table with the intensity of someone monitoring a chess game. Now she said, "Evelyn, do you know how to make a proper Christmas dinner? Papa made chicken last year, and it was dry." "The chicken was fine," Caleb said. "It was dry, Papa." "We have the fixings for a decent meal," Evelyn said. "What do you have?" Maisie jumped up and began opening cabinet doors with proprietary confidence. rattling off the contents with the cheerful authority of someone who had been waiting for an opportunity to be helpful. Evelyn listened, asked 2 or 3 practical questions, and then began moving around the kitchen with the quiet efficiency of someone who had cooked in unfamiliar kitchens before and knew how to find her footing quickly. Caleb stood in the doorway and watched her and his daughter occupy the kitchen together, Maisie chattering, Evelyn listening and responding in that measured, attentive way, and felt something he didn't have a name for. Not warmth exactly. Something more like the absence of cold, like standing somewhere that was slightly less exposed than everywhere else. He went outside to seed a biscuit. The snow came in earnest after dark. By the time they sat down to the meal, Evelyn had put together salt pork and roasted potatoes, and a gravy that Caleb could not immediately explain except that it was better than anything he'd managed in 2 years. The wind had picked up outside, and the cabin had contracted around the 3 of them, the way cabins do in storms, the walls feeling slightly closer, the fire slightly more essential. Maisie talked through most of dinner. She had a gift for it, always had, filling silence with a cheerful running commentary on the world as she understood it, asking questions and answering them herself when she felt the adults were being too slow, and tonight she was particularly animated, as if she understood somehow that something new had arrived and she needed to document it properly. "Do you know any stories?" she asked Evelyn. "Papa knows some, but he always tells the same ones." "I know several stories," Evelyn said. "What kind?" "What kind do you like?" Maisie considered. "Ones where things are bad first and then they get better." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, "I know some of those." Caleb ate and said nothing. He was watching Evelyn in a way he hoped wasn't obvious, watching how she held herself, how she listened to Maisie with full attention rather than the distracted half-presence that adults usually offered children, how she ate with the focused appreciation of someone for whom a good meal was not something to be taken for granted. After dinner, he cleared the plates. He insisted on it, gesturing Evelyn back to her chair when she stood to help. And Maisie pulled Evelyn to the fireside and demanded a story. And Evelyn sat on the low chair by the hearth and told one. Something about a girl who got lost in a forest and found her way out by paying attention to things others walked past without seeing. It was simply told, no flourishes, but Maisie listened with her knees drawn up to her chest and her eyes wide. And when it ended, she said, "Tell me another one," and Evelyn told another one. Caleb washed the dishes in the kitchen and listened without meaning to. When Maisie finally went to bed, later than her usual hour, but he didn't have the heart to interrupt, Evelyn stayed by the fire and Caleb came and sat at the table with his coffee, and they were alone for the first time. The wind pushed at the walls, the fire settled. "She's a good child," Evelyn said. "She is." "She's lonely, though." He looked up. "She has me." "Yes." Evelyn's tone was careful. "She does." It wasn't a criticism, exactly. It was something more precise than that, and it landed accordingly. Caleb wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "I appreciate what you did tonight," he said. "The meal. The stories. I was doing what anyone would do, not anyone." He stopped himself before he said more. He was tired and the day had been long and he was not at his most guarded, which was not a state he was comfortable with. "I'll let you settle in," he said, pushing back his chair. "We can talk about the arrangement more tomorrow. What the work looks like, what I need." He heard how that sounded. "What the place needs. The chores." "Of course," she said. He took his coffee to the left bedroom, his bedroom now, the smaller one, and lay down in the dark without undressing and listened to the storm push at the roof. He'd expected to feel a specific kind of relief at having this done, the decision made, the woman installed. He'd expected something at least like resolution. What he felt instead was unsettled in a way he couldn't place. Like a fence post he'd driven in at what he thought was the right spot, only to realize partway through that the ground was different than he'd read it from the surface. She was not what he'd expected. He turned that over in the dark without reaching a conclusion about whether it was good or bad. The suitcase that was lighter than it should have been, the hands cracked from work, the way she'd told that story with no performance in it, just the telling, the way she'd looked at Maisie and the thing he'd seen in her face, that specific quality of paying attention as if the child mattered, not as a gesture, but as a fact. The wind came under the door a little, the cold finding its way in the way it always did out here, no matter what you did to stop it. He pulled the blanket up and closed his eyes. Outside, the snow came down and kept coming, sealing the ranch in, sealing them in. Three people who were strangers to each other trying to figure out what they'd made when they'd agreed to share a roof. He didn't know what any of it would look like by spring. He went to sleep not knowing, which was, he supposed, the only honest position available. Christmas morning arrived gray and still. The storm had spent itself overnight and left behind a white silence so complete that when Caleb woke and opened the cabin door, he could hear nothing. No wind, no animals, no distant sound of anything. Just the flat, clean absence of sound that deep snow makes, the world muffled under a weight of white that made the familiar yard look like somewhere he'd never been. He built the fire back up and put the coffee on and stood at the window drinking the first cup and looking at the snow, and not thinking about anything in particular when he heard movement from the right bedroom. Evelyn emerged fully dressed, hair pinned, looking like she'd been awake for a while. She saw him standing at the window and stopped. "You're up early," she said. "I'm always up early." She went to the stove and poured herself coffee without asking, which he found he didn't mind. She came and stood near the window, not next to him but nearby, and looked at the same white yard. "It's beautiful," she said. "It's a lot of snow." Both things can be true. He glanced at her. She was looking out the window with something in her expression he hadn't seen yesterday. Not exactly peace, but something that came from the same direction. Like she was looking at something that agreed with her. "You've never been in Wyoming before," he said. "No, Missouri was flat. This is—" She paused. "This is a lot of everything." "It gets old." "Maybe." She didn't sound convinced. They stood in the early quiet of Christmas morning, the fire going, the coffee warming their hands, and Caleb thought, "This is the strangest thing. Not bad strange, just strange. A woman he didn't know in his kitchen on Christmas morning, the snow outside, the particular silence. The door to Maisie's room banged open, and the child arrived in her nightgown with her hair wild and her eyes completely awake, which was the only way Maisie ever woke up. "Is it Christmas?" she demanded, looking between them. "It is," Evelyn said. "Did you see the snow?" "Papa, did you see the snow?" "I saw it. It's so much. Can we go out in it after breakfast? Can we make something?" "After breakfast," Caleb said. "After you're dressed." Maisie spun back into her room to get dressed, and Evelyn turned to the stove and began putting together breakfast with the same quiet efficiency as the night before. And Caleb stood and watched the snow outside and the fire inside and the small, ordinary domestic activity of a woman making breakfast in his kitchen on Christmas morning, and felt again that thing he didn't have a name for. That absence of cold feeling. He didn't examine it. He just stood there and let it be what it was, and listened to Maisie singing to herself in the back room, and watched the snow on the fence posts catch the first pale light of a winter morning, and didn't say anything about any of it. Some things, he was learning, didn't need to be said right away. The snow that had fallen on Christmas Eve didn't melt. It settled in and stayed, the way Wyoming winter snow did, not the wet, heavy kind that came apart in your hands, but the dry, packed kind that turned to crust in the wind and then to something harder than crust when the temperature dropped below a certain point and stayed there. By the day after Christmas, the road to Harwick was impassable for anything short of a determined horse with good footing, and by the day after that it didn't matter because a second storm came in from the north and added another 8 inches on top of what was already there. And by the end of the week, Caleb's world had contracted to the size of his property, and the 4 animals in his barn, and the 2 people now sharing his cabin. He'd lived through worse winters. He knew what this kind of isolation felt like. The cabin walls pulling in, the days shortening to a gray slot between dark and dark, the particular restlessness of a man who needed to be working something and found himself instead orbiting the same small rooms. He knew all of it. What he didn't know was what it felt like with someone else in the house who wasn't Maisie. Evelyn was up before him every morning. He didn't know when she slept. By the time he came out of the left bedroom, she had the fire rebuilt and the coffee going and was usually engaged in some task he hadn't asked her to do. Mending something, cleaning something, reorganizing the pantry with the focused quiet of someone who found it easier to work than to sit still. The first morning he told her she didn't need to do all that. She'd looked at him and said, "I know I don't need to." And that was the end of that conversation. She was not what he'd expected. He kept coming back to that, kept turning it over, because he hadn't fully worked out yet whether it was a problem or not. What he'd expected, if he was honest with himself in the specific way he usually avoided being, was someone grateful. Someone who understood she was getting a roof over her head and security she hadn't had and would behave accordingly, quietly, obligingly, in a way that didn't require him to adjust. What Evelyn Hart was something other than that. She was not ungrateful exactly, but she carried herself with a kind of self-possession that made gratitude seem beside the point. Like she'd arrived not as someone who'd been rescued, but as someone who'd made a decision and intended to carry it through properly. It was, Caleb found, both harder and easier to live with than what he'd imagined. The work she took on without being asked accumulated in small ways that added up to something he couldn't ignore. The curtains she washed and rehung on the third day, which turned out to be a different color underneath the grime than he'd remembered. Blue, not gray. The hinge on the cabinet door that had been loose since October, and that he'd been meaning to fix, and that one morning was simply fixed, the tool left clean and put away on the shelf. The way the food stretched further than it should have, because she knew things about cooking that he didn't. How to use the fat from salt pork to make the beans better. How to add a little of this and a little of that to turn a limited pantry into something that didn't feel limited. He noticed all of it. He didn't say much about any of it. On the fourth day, he came in from the barn to find Maisie sitting at the kitchen table with her tongue between her teeth, bent over a piece of paper, and Evelyn sitting across from her with another piece of paper and a pencil. "No," Evelyn was saying, patient but direct. "Look, the letters go this way. E goes forward, not backward." "It looks the same to me," Maisie said, genuinely baffled. "It doesn't go the same. Look at my hand." Evelyn drew the letter slowly. "See how the lines go toward the right? Your E was going left. Mirror image." Maisie studied both versions with fierce concentration. "Why does it matter which way it goes?" "Because if it goes the wrong way, someone else can't read it. And if they can't read it, what's the point of writing it at all?" Maisie considered this seriously. "To know it yourself," she said. Evelyn paused. "That's true," she said. "But knowing it yourself and sharing it are both worth doing. You can decide which one you're going for." Maisie chewed on that for a moment, then bent back over her paper and drew the E again, carefully, going the right direction this time. Caleb stood in the doorway with snow melting off his boots and watched and didn't announce himself. After a moment, he backed out quietly and went to pull his boots off on the porch. And by the time he came back in, he'd composed himself enough to cross to the stove and pour coffee without making it strange. Nobody said anything about it, but something had been established in that kitchen, some fact about what this woman was willing to do and how she was going to do it, and Caleb filed it away with the other facts he was accumulating and said nothing. The days had a rhythm to them, which was both easier and harder than the absence of rhythm. Caleb did the barn work in the mornings, the horses, the 2 milk cows, the half-dozen chickens that had survived the fall, and then came in and ate the breakfast Evelyn had made and went back out if there was outside work to do, which in this weather there mostly wasn't, just checking fences and keeping paths clear and the kind of maintenance that never ended. Evelyn ran the house. Maisie went back and forth between them, following Caleb to the barn in the mornings and attaching herself to Evelyn in the afternoons. The way children do with new things, methodically investigating. On the 6th day, Caleb came in from the barn and found Evelyn at the kitchen table with her head bent over what looked like one of his shirts. "That's mine," he said. "I know." She didn't look up. "The seam on the shoulder is coming apart. Another week and you'll have lost the sleeve." He looked at the shirt. He'd noticed the seam. He'd been ignoring it because he had enough shirts to rotate, and the act of mending something required sitting still with needle and thread, which was not a thing he was naturally inclined toward. "You don't have to do that," he said. "You said that about the curtains, too." "I meant it both times." She set down the needle and looked up at him. It was the first time she'd stopped working to look at him directly in several days, and the directness of her gaze was something he hadn't quite gotten used to. She didn't look at people sideways. "Caleb," she said, "what is it that's bothering you about this? Because I want to be clear about whether it's the doing it or the not asking first." He opened his mouth and then closed it. He stood there for a moment, feeling like she'd moved something he'd been leaning on without warning him. "I'm not bothered," he said. "You look bothered. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, which surprised both of them. I'm not used to Tom. He stopped again. This was the problem. He could say the words, but the sentence kept getting away from him because the honest end of it was something like someone taking care of things without being asked, or someone being here, and both of those led to places he didn't want to go. I can ask before I do things, Evelyn said, her tone not unkind. If that's what you need. It's not that. Then what is it? He picked up the coffee cup that was already on the table, hers, he realized, too late, but she didn't say anything, and turned it in his hands. Eleanor, he said, and then stopped. It was the first time he'd said his wife's name out loud since he couldn't remember when. It landed differently than he expected, not like opening a wound, more like pressing on a bruise that had been there so long he'd stopped checking whether it was still there. Evelyn waited. She was good at waiting, he'd noticed. She didn't fill silence just to fill it. She used to do that, he said. The mending. She kept everything. Nothing fell apart while she was here. He set down the cup. I'm not comparing you to her. I'm just telling you why it's... He didn't have a word for it. Strange, he said finally. It's strange. I understand strange, Evelyn said quietly. He looked at her. She had picked up the needle again and was looking at the seam, not at him, giving him the room to have said what he'd said without it becoming more than it was. She sounds like she was a careful woman, Evelyn said. She was. Good. She pulled a stitch through. That's a good thing for Maisie to come from. He didn't answer. He sat there a moment longer and then pushed back his chair and stood. I'll be in the back, he said. There's tack that needs work. I'll call when dinner's ready. He went out to the back room and he sat with the harness in his hands, and he didn't work on it for a while. He just sat with the particular weight of a conversation that had gone someplace he hadn't planned for it to go and tried to decide whether he minded. 2 weeks in, Maisie got a cough. It came on fast the way childhood coughs did, a tickle on a Tuesday that was a full rattle by Wednesday night. Caleb had dealt with Maisie's coughs before and knew they tended to dig in for a week or so, filling the cabin with the wet, rattling sound of a child breathing through a chest that didn't want to cooperate. He went for the camphor from the shelf above the stove and found the tin nearly empty. He stood there holding it, doing the arithmetic on how long it would last against how long the road to Harwick was likely to stay impassable, when Evelyn appeared beside him. Let me see, she said. He handed her the tin. She looked at the amount left. This will do for 2 days, she said. Maybe 3 if we're careful. Road won't be clear in 2 days. No. She set the tin down and turned to look at the pantry, the assessing look he'd come to recognize, the one where she was calculating something in her head that he couldn't follow yet. What have you got in the way of dried herbs? Anything on the drying shelf? Some sage, thyme, there might be some yarrow left from last summer. Show me the yarrow. He found it on the back shelf, a small bundle he'd hung up and forgotten. Eleanor had done that, had kept herbs, and he'd maintained the habit in a vague way without knowing exactly what most of them were for. He handed the bundle to Evelyn, and she took it with the confidence of someone who knew what she was looking at. This is good, she said. And do you have any honey? Real honey, not the processed kind? There's a half jar. I was saving it. We need it now. He got out the honey. He did not ask whether she knew what she was doing, which was not a thing that came naturally to him with people he'd known for 2 weeks. But there was something in the way she moved around his kitchen, purposeful, without waste, that made the question seem unnecessary. She made a tea from the yarrow and had Maisie breathe over the steam, then added honey and got her to drink it slowly. She rubbed the camphor on Maisie's chest with practiced hands and propped her with an extra pillow and explained in the steady, no-nonsense tone she used with the child that the cough needed to come out, that fighting it would only make it worse, that the best thing to do was rest and drink liquids and let the body do what it was trying to do. Maisie, who normally negotiated every aspect of being sick as if it were a contract under dispute, listened to all of this and said, "Okay," and lay back against the pillow. Caleb stood in the doorway and watched. The tea helped. By that night, Maisie's breathing had loosened, and by the second day, the rattle was less prominent. And by the third day, she was sitting up in bed asking Evelyn to continue the story she'd started 2 days earlier, about the girl in the forest. There were apparently more chapters than Caleb had realized. On the 4th day, Maisie was up and moving around the cabin again, somewhat diminished but functional. And in the evening, she climbed onto the chair next to Evelyn while Evelyn was working on something at the table and leaned against her arm the way she sometimes leaned against Caleb's arm when she was tired. Just leaned. Like it was natural. Like Evelyn was someone to lean on. Evelyn looked down at her and then looked up and found Caleb watching from across the room. And for a moment they looked at each other, and then both of them looked away. On a Wednesday, the third week of January, the weather broke enough that Caleb could get to Harwick. He left early and came back by early afternoon with flour, salt, more camphor than they'd ever need, and a parcel from the post office that had arrived for him before Christmas and been waiting. He set everything on the table, and Evelyn cataloged the provisions with that same quiet efficiency, making notes in her head that he knew would show up later in the stretched, careful way she managed the pantry. While she was organizing, he took the parcel to the table and opened it. Inside was a letter from a neighbor 2 ranches over and a package of seeds. Vegetable seeds, for spring planting, a variety he'd been considering for the back field. He was looking at the seed packets when Evelyn glanced over. "Planting for spring?" she asked. "Thinking about it." "What's the soil like in the backfield?" He told her. She asked 2 or 3 more questions about drainage and sun exposure that indicated she'd been paying attention to the geography of the place in a way he hadn't realized, and they ended up spending 20 minutes at the table with the seed packet spread between them talking about what should go where, and it was only afterward, when Maisie came in and found them and wanted to know what they were doing, that Caleb realized it had been 20 minutes during which he hadn't been thinking about anything other than the practical question in front of him. He had not had 20 minutes like that in longer than he could remember. He went to bed that night with the seeds on the shelf and something unsettled in his chest that wasn't unpleasant exactly, just unfamiliar. The sensation of a room that had been closed for a long time and had been opened and aired and was now a different temperature than it had been. She'd told him she was a school teacher. He knew that from her letters. But knowing it and seeing what it meant were different things, and what he kept seeing. In the way she handled Maisie's lessons, in the careful patience with which she explained things, in the economy of her explanations, never more words than needed, never fewer, was what 7 years of teaching had done to a person. It had given her a particular kind of attention. She could see where someone was stuck. She could find the words that fit the specific shape of the stuck. He saw it with Maisie. He saw it more slowly and more uncomfortably in the occasional exchanges she had with him. Not that she tried to teach him anything. She wasn't like that. Wasn't the kind of person who gave unsolicited instruction or implied that someone else didn't know enough. But sometimes she asked a question that was more precise than he expected, that found a gap he hadn't known was there, and it annoyed him, and then later made him think. And the thinking usually led somewhere useful. One afternoon toward the end of January, with the weather holding steady and the world outside the windows doing nothing in particular, she told him more about Missouri. Not because he hadn't asked, didn't know how to ask, was not naturally a person who asked questions about other people's lives and waited for the answers, but because she seemed to have arrived at the point where not saying it felt more effortful than saying it. Her father had been a man of what she called expansive expectations. He'd had a farm, and then he'd had debts against the farm, and then he'd had debts against the debts, and by the time Evelyn was 25, the whole architecture of what her family owned had come apart in about 8 months. The school where she'd been teaching had been funded in part by her father's estate, and when the estate dissolved, the board had found a reason to let her go. Politely, with regret expressed in the careful language of people who are doing something unkind and know it. "I taught in 2 other places after that," she said. "One didn't last the season, one lasted 2 years before the funding ran out. I was 30 years old, and I had $30 in a suitcase and a list of references from people who were sorry they couldn't hire me but couldn't hire me." She said it without self-pity, just the facts, laid out. "I'm not telling you this so you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because you've been trying to figure out what I'm doing here. And that's what I'm doing here. I ran out of other options." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "That's honest," he said. "I think we both deserve honesty. Did you consider—" He didn't know how to finish this tactfully and gave up trying. "Were there other choices, other than this?" "There are always other choices," she said. "Most of them were worse." She looked at her hands, which were folded on the table in front of her. "I want to be clear about something, Caleb. I'm not here under false pretenses. I'm not going to pretend this is a love story. I think I think if two people are willing to try and neither of them is dishonest, they can build something real. That's what I'm offering. I'm not sure what it is you're offering, but I'd like to know." He thought about it. He'd never had anyone put it to him quite that directly before, which was strange given that this was supposed to be a mutually agreed upon arrangement. He'd been treating it, he realized, like a business transaction that would sort itself out through proximity, as if they'd just eventually settle into something without either of them having to say what it was. "I think I'm offering the same thing," he said, trying, without dishonesty. She nodded. "That's enough to work with." It wasn't romantic. It wasn't the kind of conversation you'd tell anyone about as if it were a story. But something in the room shifted, some minor but real recalibration, and they both felt it and neither mentioned it and went back to what they'd been doing. And that evening at dinner, something was different. Not dramatically, not in any way Maisie would necessarily notice, but different, less careful, less provisional. By February, the ranch had a different feel to it. Not transformed, not anything so dramatic as that. But things were running better than they'd run in 2 years. The animals were healthier, the food was more consistent, the cabin was warmer, not from any physical change, but from the presence of activity, of purpose, of 2 adults working in parallel instead of one man working alone, while a 6-year-old trailed behind him. Maisie was reading. Not well, not yet, but real words on real pages, the letters going the right direction, the sounds coming together with increasing confidence. Evelyn ran the lessons every afternoon at the kitchen table, and sometimes Caleb could hear them from the back room where he was doing tack work or woodworking. Maisie sounding out a word, Evelyn's voice responding, and the particular silence that meant Maisie was concentrating. One afternoon he listened to Maisie read 3 sentences without stopping, and he had to put down what he was working on and sit for a minute. Eleanor had wanted her to read, had talked about it, had written down a list of books she wanted Maisie to have. She hadn't had the time to start before. Caleb had never let himself finish that thought before and didn't finish it now. But he sat with it longer than usual. He went to the kitchen doorway. Maisie was bent over her reader, finger tracing the line. Evelyn was watching her with the focused, patient attention she always had in these moments. "She's doing well," he said. Evelyn looked up. "She's doing very well," she said. "She has a good memory. Once she has a word, she keeps it." Maisie looked up from her page with the expression of someone who has been talked about and doesn't entirely mind. "I'm getting better," she confirmed. "You are," Caleb said. He stood there a moment longer. "Thank you," he said to Evelyn. It came out simpler and more direct than he usually managed, and he wasn't entirely sure how that had happened. Evelyn looked at him steadily. "It's not a difficulty," she said. "She makes it easy." He nodded and went back to what he'd been doing, and if his hands weren't quite as sure on the work for the next few minutes, he didn't note it. The hardest nights were the quiet ones. February had a particular kind of quiet after dark, when the wind died and the snow sat still and the fire burned low, and Maisie had gone to bed, and it was just the 2 of them in the main room. They'd developed a habit without planning to. Caleb at the table with his coffee or his bookkeeping, Evelyn in the chair by the fire with mending or her own reading, a lamp between them, not talking much, each of them inside their own thoughts, but not alone inside them. He was aware of her in the room. He was aware of it in the way you become aware of something you've gotten used to, not as excitement, which he mistrusted, but as something quieter and therefore more alarming. The fact that when she was in the room, he was less alone than when she wasn't. The fact that when she went to bed and the room was only his again, there was something missing from it. He didn't know what to do with that. He told himself it was proximity. Told himself that any 2 adults sharing close quarters through a Wyoming winter would develop some form of, he didn't have a word for it, habit, maybe, mutual adjustment. He told himself it had nothing to do with the specific person she was, her particular quality of paying attention, the way she never said more than she meant, the way she was honest about hard things without making them dramatic. He told himself all of this and it worked, mostly, until one evening in late February when Maisie had gone to bed early with a headache and the cabin was quieter than usual, and Evelyn was in the chair and he was at the table, and she laughed. Not a big laugh. Something that came out unexpectedly while she was reading, a short involuntary sound of genuine amusement that she covered immediately with her hand and looked up to see if Maisie had heard. She found Caleb looking at her instead. "Sorry," she said. What is it? She turned the book so he could see the page. It was a book of frontier accounts he'd had on the shelf for years. A writer describing with tremendous solemnity his encounter with a badger that turned out, after several paragraphs of escalating drama, to have been a very large rock. Caleb read the passage. Something in his face moved. He looked up at her. She was watching him with that direct gaze, waiting, and there was something in her expression that was different from the careful, measured way she usually looked at him. Something more open, like she'd let the measuring down for a moment. He looked away first. He was very frightened of the rock, Caleb said. Apparently, Evelyn said. He turned back to his bookkeeping. She turned back to her reading. The fire crackled once and settled. Neither of them said anything else for a long time. But that open look, brief as it was, quickly recovered, was something Caleb carried around for days afterward without wanting to, turning it over at odd moments, in the barn in the morning, lying awake at night. The walls he'd been maintaining, steady and deliberate, were not falling down. They were doing something more inconvenient than that. They were developing small cracks, invisible from the outside, the kind that didn't look like anything until one day they were everywhere. He didn't know what to do about that either, so he did what he always did when he didn't know what to do about something. He went to work. And the winter held, and the days kept passing, and Evelyn Hart kept living in his house, and mending his things, and teaching his daughter, and being quietly and without apparent effort, exactly as herself. And Caleb Rowan kept trying to decide whether that was a problem. The first week of March arrived with a brief thaw, 3 days of temperatures that climbed just enough to soften the top layer of snow and make the road to Harwick passable again without it being comfortable. Caleb had been putting off the trip for weeks. Supplies were holding, the weather had made it easy to find reasons not to go. But there was fencing wire he needed and seed catalog orders that had to be placed before the spring planting window closed. And one morning he came in from the barn and told Evelyn he was going to town. She was at the table with Maisie, midway through the morning lesson. She looked up and nodded. I'll make a list of what we need from the general store. I've got the list. I'd like to add a few things. She said it quietly without making it a point of argument, and he waited while she wrote 4 items on the corner of Maisie's paper and tore it off and handed it to him. Thread, she'd written, and 2 specific things for the kitchen and a small notebook for Maisie. He folded it and put it in his breast pocket. I'll be back by mid-afternoon, he said. Keep the fire up. Maisie looked up from her page. Bring me something. Like what? Surprise me. That's not how I shop. Try it, Maisie said, with the serene confidence of someone who believes they are easy to please, which she was not. He left before she could negotiate further. The road to Harwick was worse than he'd hoped and better than he'd feared. The ruts were soft on top and iron underneath, and Biscuit picked through them with her usual stoic competence, and they made town in just under an hour. Caleb tied the mare at the post outside the general store and went in to get what he needed, and that was where it started, though he didn't understand that until later. The store was run by a man named Hendrik Voss, heavy-set and deliberate, who had operated the place for 15 years and knew everything about everyone in the county because everything everyone needed came through his door eventually. He was behind the counter when Caleb came in, tallying something in his ledger, and he looked up and nodded the greeting of a man who sees many people and reserves warmth for the ones he's decided to reserve it for. Rowan, he said, thought the winner had you. Almost, Caleb said. He put his list on the counter and began walking the shelves for what he could find himself. Road's not good, but it's passable. Heard you had a visitor at Christmas, Voss said. Caleb kept his back to the counter. Word travels. This is Harwick. Voss wrote something in his ledger. Mrs. Delacroix saw her at the stage, said she looked a pause that was a little too considered. Said she came in light. She did, Caleb said. He put the fencing wire on the counter and the hardware pieces and worked through his list methodically, not inviting more, but Voss was the kind of man who didn't require invitation. Stage driver said the same thing, Voss continued. Said she had one bag and the coat she was wearing had been mended so many times you could hardly tell what the original was. I'm not sure what the driver's coat observations have to do with my fencing wire, Caleb said. Voss had the grace to look mildly embarrassed. I'm just telling you what people are saying. Don't shoot the man with the information. What are people saying exactly? It was not quite a question. Voss set down his pencil and looked at Caleb with the careful expression of someone deciding how direct to be. That she's got nothing, he said. That you picked up a woman who came here because she had nowhere else to go, and that... He stopped. And that what? Voss looked uncomfortable, which was not an expression Caleb had seen on him before. That Eleanor would not have approved, he said quietly. That's what some folks are saying. I'm not saying it myself. I'm telling you what's being said. The store was quiet for a moment. Caleb stood at the counter and looked at the man across it and felt something cold settle in his chest that was not the weather. Ring up the list, he said. I've got 2 more stops to make. What? The 2 more stops were the hardware supplier on the far end of the main street and the post office. He got through the hardware without incident, but the post office shared its small space with the barber shop. And in a town the size of Harwick, the barber shop on a Thursday morning in early March, when not much else was happening, was where you went if you wanted to find 3 or 4 men who had opinions about everything and time to share them. There were 4 men in there when Caleb came in. He knew them all by name and by type. Franklin Gear, who farmed the big spread north of town and considered himself the informal authority on what the county's standards should be. Walt Pruitt, who was Gear's neighbor and who, as far as Caleb had ever been able to determine, had no opinions of his own but was very skilled at having Gears. The barber, a small man named Crockett, who kept his own counsel but had ears like a field rabbit. And Ed Sutherland, who ran cattle on the South Range and who Caleb had always respected as a man who said what he meant and usually meant something reasonable. He was picking up a package at the post office counter, a seed catalog that had been held for him since January, when Gear spoke. Rowan, the man said from the barber's chair where he was getting his hair done, how's that new wife of yours settling in? The way he said wife, that slight pause before the word, that fractional adjustment of tone that put something else in alongside the word itself, told Caleb everything he needed to know about the direction this was going. Fine, Caleb said. He signed for the package. Heard she came in looking like she'd been through some difficult years, Gear said. Heard she didn't bring much. I heard the same thing, Pruitt offered, right on schedule. Caleb tucked the package under his arm. She came from a hard situation, he said, keeping his voice even. Most people out here came from hard situations. Sure, Gear said. Sure, that's true. I just think, well, a man in your position, Rowan, decent ranch, good land, and Eleanor's memory to respect. People talk about what kind of woman a man chooses after something like that. Says something about him. People talk about a lot of things, Caleb said. They do. Gear was watching him in the barbershop mirror, and there was something in the watching that Caleb didn't like. The particular expression of a man who believes he's being reasonable when he's being something else. It's just, Eleanor was someone everyone in this county respected. She had standing, she had family, she was a woman of worth, Rowan, and everyone knew it. And now you've brought in someone who nobody knows, with nothing to her name, and people wonder whether you've thought it through. Or whether the loneliness got the better of him, Pruitt said, and then seemed to realize he'd said it out loud and looked briefly uncertain about that. The room was quiet. Crockett kept his scissors moving. Sutherland was looking at the floor with the careful attention of a man who didn't want to be involved in this but wasn't going to intervene either. Caleb stood at the post office counter and felt the thing in his chest that had been cold since the general store go a degree colder. He was not a man who lost his temper in public. He'd always considered that a point of pride. But there was a specific kind of anger that came from hearing something said about someone else, someone who wasn't there to answer. And it was different from the anger of being insulted yourself. It sat lower and burned longer. I've thought it through, he said. He said it flatly, no heat in it, which was a thing he'd learned from his father. The flattest voice carried the furthest. He left before Gear could say anything else. He rode home slower than he'd ridden to town. It was the word worth that stayed with him. He didn't want it to. He turned over the ride home, trying to put Gear and his barbershop pronouncements where they belonged, which was in the category of other men's opinions about things that were not their business. He had always been able to do that, had always had a reasonably thick skin about what Harwick chose to say about Caleb Rowan and the choices he made. He had never cared much for the social arithmetic of the county, who had standing and who didn't, who had come from what and brought how much. He had never cared about it. That was what he told himself. But Gear's words had gotten in under something. the way cold got in under a door you thought you'd sealed. Eleanor's memory to respect, as if Eleanor were a standard that other women were required to meet, as if Evelyn's worn boots and patched coat were an insult to something. He came home and put up the horse and came inside and set the supplies on the table and barely looked at Evelyn when she came to check them over. And he was aware, in the specific way you are aware of your own behavior when you're watching yourself from slightly outside yourself, that he was pulling in, going somewhere interior. He knew that about himself. When something got under the skin, he went quiet and distant. Not out of cruelty, but out of the particular incapacity that came with not knowing what to do with the thing. Evelyn noticed. Of course she noticed. She had the kind of attention that noticed everything without commenting on most of it, and she cataloged the supplies and thanked him for the thread and asked about the road conditions for the trip back, and she asked all of it in the same measured, capable tone she always used, and she did not ask what was wrong, which was somehow worse than if she had asked. Maisie got the notebook he'd remembered at the last minute to buy, and was delighted by it, and the afternoon went on around him the way afternoons did. Maisie's lesson, the prep for dinner, the small commerce of the household, and Caleb moved through it without being entirely inside it. That night at dinner, he was quieter than usual, and even Maisie, who was not always attuned to adult weather systems, looked at him twice over her plate. After Maisie went to bed, Evelyn came and sat at the table across from him with her tea. Not with her mending, not with her book, just with the tea in her hands, and she looked at him with that direct gaze and said, "What happened in town?" It wasn't a question. He turned his coffee cup. "Nothing happened. I got the supplies." "Something happened." He was quiet for a moment. He considered several versions of this conversation and discarded most of them. "Gear was at the barber shop," he said. "Franklin Gear, the big farm north of town." "You know him?" "I've never met him, but Maisie mentioned him once, said he looks at people like he's calculating their price." She said it without emphasis, just observing. "What did he say?" Caleb told her. "Not all of it, but enough. Voss in the general store, Gear in the barber shop, the specific gravity of what had been said and who had been in the room to hear it. He told it plainly, the way she'd told him about Missouri, without self-pity and without drama, and he watched her face while he told it. She didn't look surprised. That was the thing that got him. She looked like someone receiving news that confirmed something she'd already understood. "I should have expected it," she said, "coming here looking the way I looked." She was looking at the table, not at him. A town like this has a long memory for what people arrive with. "It's not right," he said. "What they're saying." "No," she agreed, "but it's not surprising." "That doesn't mean—" "Caleb." She looked up at him. "What I'm trying to understand is not whether what they said is fair. It isn't, I know that. What I'm trying to understand is what you think about it." He opened his mouth and closed it. The fire made a sound. Somewhere outside, the wind had picked up again. "I think they're wrong," he said. "About what, specifically?" "About—" He stopped. "About what worth looks like. About Eleanor being a standard. About you being a deficiency." He thought all of it and said none of it. And the gap between what he thought and what he could find words for was exactly the gap that Evelyn was looking at. And she could see it. He knew she could see it. "You don't have to protect me from their opinions," she said quietly. "I've had worse things said about me than that I came to Wyoming with a worn coat. But I need to know whether you've been sitting there tonight thinking they might have a point." It hit him harder than he expected, because the honest answer was complicated. Not because he thought she was without worth. Not that. Not for a moment. But because the conversation in the barber shop had done something he hadn't expected, had reached into some older and less examined part of him, the part that cared what Harwick thought, the part that had cared what Harwick thought for 20 years without admitting it, and had stirred something there that he was not proud of. "No," he said, and then, more honestly, "not about you." She was quiet, looking at him, waiting for the rest of it. "About myself," he said. "About whether I can, about whether this is—" He pushed the coffee cup away from him. "I'm not explaining this well." "You're explaining it well enough," she said. She looked down at her tea. "You care what they think." "I always have," he said. "I know I'm not supposed to. I know a man's supposed to stand above that. But I've lived in this county for 35 years, and those are the people I sell cattle to and borrow equipment from, and that's He stopped. It matters. I hate that it matters, but it does. She nodded slowly. I know, she said. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. It matters in practical ways, the way a community matters. She was quiet for a moment. But there's a difference between understanding that it matters and letting it make decisions for you. He didn't answer that. He sat with it, and it was accurate enough to be uncomfortable, and the silence stretched between them. I'm not going to beg you to keep me here, she said. She said it carefully, each word placed. I want to be very clear about that. If you decide the cost of what they're saying is too high, I will pack my things and go, and I won't make it harder than it needs to be. You and Maisie this has been more than I expected, and I won't hold that against you, whatever you decide. He looked at her. Something in him went very still. I haven't decided anything, he said. I know. She stood up, taking her cup. I'm just telling you the options. She went to the kitchen and he heard her pour out the rest of the tea and set the cup in the basin, and then she said goodnight and went to her room, and the door closed with the quiet, definitive sound of someone who is going to sleep whatever happened next. Caleb sat alone at the table for a long time. What followed was a week that he would not be able to explain to anyone later, not because it was dramatic in any external way. Nothing broke, nothing was said that was irreversible. The household kept running on the same practical rails it had been running on for 6 weeks, but because something had shifted in the quality of how he occupied the same space as Evelyn. He had withdrawn. He knew he was doing it, and he did it anyway. The way you pick at a sore you know you should leave alone, some self-protective instinct overriding the more intelligent part of himself. He was polite. He was present at meals. He answered when spoken to. But the evenings in the main room where they'd developed the habit of sitting near each other without needing to fill the air, those changed. He started finding reasons to go to bed earlier, work reasons. Reasons that were technically true in the way that the most dishonest things usually have some technical truth to them. Evelyn did not comment on it. She continued her lessons with Maisie, continued running the household, continued being exactly herself in every observable way. And the fact that she wasn't pressing him, wasn't asking questions or demanding explanations, made it worse somehow. It would have been easier if she'd been hurt in a visible way, if she'd given him something to respond to. Instead, she was just present, continuing. And the continuing felt like an indictment of the withdrawing. Maisie was the one who noticed in the specific way a child notices things, which is without the filter adults use to decide whether they should say what they're observing. It was a Thursday afternoon. Caleb was in the back room with the door partially open, working on a piece of harness he'd been meaning to repair for a month, and Maisie came in from the kitchen and stood in the doorway and looked at him. Are you mad at Evelyn? She said. He kept his eyes on the harness. No. You're acting like you're mad at her. I'm not mad at her. Then why are you being weird again? He set down the leather. I'm not being weird. I'm doing repairs. You've been doing repairs in here every night for a week. Maisie came into the room and sat on the old trunk in the corner, the one with Eleanor's winter things in it that he hadn't opened in 2 years, and looked at him with her mother's eyes and her mother's directness. Is she leaving? No. You're sure? He looked at his daughter. She was sitting with her hands flat on her knees, back straight, the posture of someone bracing for something. 6 years old and bracing. Why would she leave? He said. Because you're being the way you get when you're scared, Maisie said. You did it after Mama. You stayed outside all the time and came in late, and I could hear you not sleeping. She said it simply, not to wound him, just reporting what she'd observed. You get small when you're scared. You make yourself small, and you go somewhere inside, and then everything feels far away. He was quiet for a moment. The harness sat on the bench in front of him, and he looked at it without seeing it. I'm not scared, he said. Maisie looked at him with the expression of a 6-year-old who is being patient with someone older than her who is not behaving as well as they might. Papa, she said, I don't want her to leave. She's not leaving. I know you said that, but I need her to not leave. Maisie's voice was still steady, but something in it had shifted to the edge of something. She stays up at night when I'm sick. She remembers which words are hard for me, and she doesn't make me feel stupid about them. She fixes things without making a big deal about it. Maisie stopped, looking for the word, and then found it. She's here. She's actually here. And I don't want her to go away like... She stopped. She didn't say like Mama. But it was in the air between them, that specific unfinished sentence, and it hung there long after she stopped speaking. Caleb set down the harness and rubbed his hands on his knees and looked at his daughter on the trunk that held his dead wife's winter things and felt something inside him crack open that he hadn't known was shut. "She's not going anywhere," he said. He meant it this time differently than he'd meant it the first time. The first time it had been something he believed was true. This time it was a decision. Maisie looked at him for a long moment, assessing, the way she always assessed the things adults said to see if they were true. Then she nodded, once, got up off the trunk, and left the room. He sat alone in the back room for a while. Then he went to find Evelyn. Up. She was in the main room, in the chair by the fire, with her book. The lamp was burning and the fire was low and needed to be fed, and she hadn't fed it because it wasn't her habit to let the fire die unnecessarily, and so she would get to it in a moment. That was just what she was like. And the ordinary observation of this ordinary thing went through Caleb with something that felt like the word gratitude, but was more specific than that. She looked up when he came in, and then looked back at her book, giving him the option of this being nothing, of him having come through on his way to somewhere else. He sat down in the chair across from her. She lowered the book. They looked at each other across the low fire, and Caleb said, "I owe you an apology." She was quiet. He stopped and made himself start again honestly. "I've been letting what Gear said get to me. I've been letting it change how I'm showing up here, and that's not fair, and it's not right, and I should have said that days ago." Evelyn set the book in her lap. She was looking at him with that direct, measuring gaze that he'd come to recognize as her particular form of paying attention. "What changed?" she said. "Maisie," he said. Something moved in her face. Not quite a smile. Something sadder and more real than a smile. "She's a good person," Evelyn said. "She is." He turned his hands over on his knees, looking at them. "She said something. She has a way of saying things that are true in a way I can't argue with. She's had that since she was 2. He looked up. "She said she doesn't want you to go. She said it like it was a fact she'd already decided, not a preference. She said it like it mattered the way food matters." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was careful, held steady by something visible. "I need you to understand something," she said. "I can manage Gear. I can manage what a town says about a woman who came in with a patched coat. I have managed things considerably worse than that, and I'm not going to fall apart because Franklin Gear has opinions." She paused. "What I cannot manage is being in a house where I don't know from one day to the next where I stand, where I've started to do something real, and then the ground shifts under it because someone in a barbershop said something and you don't know whether you believe it." "I know," he said. "That's what I'm saying I'm sorry for." "I need to know it won't happen again," she said. "Not that you'll never have doubts or difficulties. I'm not asking for that. But this specific thing, running cold because of what Harwick says, I need to know that's over." He met her eyes. "It's over," he said. "I mean that." She looked at him for a long time. She was deciding something, he knew, making an internal calculation about whether she believed him. And he understood that this was not a decision he could pressure or hasten, that it was entirely hers. "All right," she said finally. "All right," he said. The fire had gotten low while they were talking. Evelyn closed her book and leaned forward and added 2 pieces of wood from the stack beside the chair, competently, without fuss, the way she did everything, and the fire responded. The room got warmer. Caleb sat in his chair, and Evelyn sat in hers, and they didn't say anything else for a while, but it was the old silence, the one from before, the not uncomfortable kind, the kind that had slowly become a habit they hadn't planned for. He picked up the section of newspaper he'd brought from Harwick and hadn't yet read, and she reopened her book, and the fire burned steadily, and outside the Wyoming night pressed against the windows. Brat. It snowed again that weekend, but a lighter snow this time, the kind that was more gesture than statement, and by Sunday afternoon it had stopped and left the world looking freshly made. Maisie went out in the afternoon with her sled, which she was old enough to operate independently if the slope was the gentle one behind the barn, and Caleb and Evelyn were in the kitchen at the same time, which happened often by now, him at the table with the seed catalogs, her putting bread to rise. She had flour on her hands from the dough, when she turned to ask him something about the bread tin that was on the high shelf, and he got it down for her, and in the getting down and the handing over their hands were briefly close, not touching, and she looked up at him. It lasted 1 second, maybe less. Then she took the tin and turned back to the counter, and he went back to the catalogs, and neither of them said anything. He looked at the seed catalog and did not take in a word of it for several minutes. That was the thing about the walls developing cracks. It wasn't that they fell down all at once. It wasn't any kind of collapse. It was just that more and more light was getting through, in moments that didn't last, in ordinary kitchen transactions, in the accidental proximity of two people sharing the same roof through the long, close winter. And each crack was small and each moment was brief, and none of them were things you could point to and say there, that one. That's when it changed. But they accumulated. They stacked up quietly in some part of Caleb that was keeping a different count than the rest of him, and the count kept rising, and he didn't say anything about it to anyone, not to Evelyn, not even to himself in the private way you say things to yourself in the dark. He just kept going. He just kept working and eating and building the fire and watching his daughter learn words and watching the woman across the room be who she was, and he did not say what he was thinking. But the thinking was changing, and the walls were full of cracks. And then one night near the end of that week, with Maisie asleep and the fire low and Evelyn already gone to her room, he sat alone at the table and he allowed himself to think the honest thought, the one he'd been working around for weeks. He did not want her to leave. Not because of Maisie. Not because the house ran better. Not because the food was good and the curtains were clean and the fences were mended and his daughter was learning to read. Because of her. Because of the specific person she was. With her direct gaze and her honest words and her refusal to be grateful in the way he'd expected, the way she'd turned out to be more than what he'd imagined when he'd been imagining all the wrong things. He sat with that for a long time. Then he got up, built the fire back to something that would last until morning, and went to bed. He lay in the dark and thought about the seed catalog on the table, about the back field, about what she'd said about the drainage and the sun exposure, about the particular quality of her attention, about the way she'd told the story about the girl in the forest, just the telling, nothing added, about the fact that she was in the next room, separated by a wall, and the house had a different temperature with her in it than it had ever had without her. He went to sleep not knowing what to do with any of it, which was, at least, more honest than where he'd been a week ago. And that, he supposed, was something. He didn't sleep well that night, or the next. It wasn't the restless kind of sleeplessness that came from worry, the circular, grinding kind where the same thought kept coming back wearing different clothes. It was something quieter and more deliberate than that. More like lying awake because being awake felt more honest than sleep. Because sleep required a kind of surrender to the unconscious, and what he needed right now was to be present with the thing he'd finally admitted to himself. He did not want her to leave. He turned that over in the dark for 2 nights running, not trying to resolve it, not building toward any particular conclusion, just letting it be what it was and seeing what it felt like with the lights off and nobody watching. It felt, surprisingly, like relief, like setting down something heavy that he'd been carrying so long he'd stopped noticing the weight. On the 3rd morning, he got up before the gray had fully come into the sky and went out to the workshop. The workshop was a lean-to on the north side of the barn, half open to the weather on one end, built by Caleb's father and expanded by Caleb when he'd needed more room. It held the tools and the spare lumber and the smell of sawdust and cold metal, and it was one of the few places on the property where Caleb could be entirely inside his own head without anyone finding him there. He came out here when he needed to think and didn't want to think in circles, because working with his hands gave the thought somewhere to go. He stood in the workshop in the dark before dawn and looked at the lumber on the wall and decided what he was going to make. It wouldn't be much, technically. He was competent with wood, but he wasn't a craftsman, had never had the patience for fine work that his father had had. But that wasn't what this required. What it required was time and attention and the willingness to make something with his own hands specifically for her, and those things he had. He found a piece of white oak that had been drying on the shelf since last summer, a short length, good grain, no knots. He took it down and turned it in his hands, and then he got out the carving tools his father had left him. Tools he used occasionally for small repairs, but rarely for anything that required real precision. And he sat down on the workbench in the cold dark and he began. He was carving a flower. He'd decided on that without knowing exactly when he'd decided. A single bloom, stylized enough that his limited skill wouldn't betray the intention, but recognizable. Evelyn had mentioned once, in passing, in the way she sometimes mentioned things without seeming to mean to, that she missed flowers. She'd said it in the context of something else, the conversation about the seed catalogs. She'd said that in Missouri she'd kept a small garden, nothing grand, just the things that came back every year without much tending, and she missed seeing color that wasn't white or gray. He'd heard it and filed it and said nothing, because that was what he did. But it had stayed. He worked by lantern light, slow and careful, the cold in his fingers making the small tools harder to manage than they would have been in summer. He made mistakes, a line that went slightly the wrong direction, a petal that came out thicker on one side than the other. He didn't try to correct the mistakes beyond what the wood would allow. He just kept going. Outside the workshop, the sky started its slow shift from black to gray to the flat, pale light of a March morning in Wyoming. And he kept working, and Biscuit moved in the barn next door, and the chickens started their morning commentary, and he kept working. He was not thinking, while he worked, about whether this was the right thing to do, or how it would be received, or what it meant in any larger framework. He was thinking about the grain of the wood and the angle of the tool and the specific way the light was falling on the bench in front of him, and underneath that thinking, very quietly, the knowledge that this was already a decision made, and he was simply executing it. That was the thing about decisions, the real ones. You usually made them before you knew you'd made them. He came in while Maisie and Evelyn were at breakfast, and he set the wooden flower on the table in front of Maisie and said, "I need to talk to Evelyn. Can you go look in on the chickens after you eat?" Maisie looked at the flower, then at him, then at Evelyn, and performed some rapid internal calculation. "Yes," she said simply, which meant she understood that something was happening and had decided to cooperate, which was not always a given. Evelyn was looking at the flower. "I made that," Caleb said, because saying nothing seemed wrong. "It's not expert work." "No," she agreed, but she picked it up, turned it in her hands, looked at it with the careful attention she gave to everything. "It's good work," she said. "The grain's right. I wanted to give you something before I said what I have to say," he said. "I didn't want it to seem like the thing and the saying were the same thing. The giving is just, it's separate. It's for the flower comment you made about your garden in Missouri. I heard that." She looked up at him. "I hear most things," he said. "I don't always acknowledge it, which is a problem I'm aware of." She set the flower down carefully on the table, not like she was putting it aside, but like she was making sure it was safe. Then she looked at him and waited. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He'd thought on the walk in from the workshop about whether to prepare what he was going to say, whether to find the right order for the words before he said them. He'd decided against it, because anything prepared would come out sounding like something prepared. And what he was trying to do here was be honest in the way she was always honest, without performance, without dressing it up. "I owe you more than an apology," he said. "I've been thinking about that for 3 days. About all of it. The apology I gave you in the main room last week, which was real, but which was also incomplete, because what I didn't say was the thing underneath the apology." He put both hands flat on the table, a habit he had when he needed to stay steady. "When Gear said what he said about worth, about Eleanor's memory, I let it get to me, and I've been honest with you about that. But what I haven't been honest about is why it got to me." "Ye got surprised." Evelyn was still watching him. "It got to me because I'd been using it," he said. "Gear's opinion, the town's opinion, the idea of what people might say, I'd been using all of that as a reason to keep a distance from you that I was keeping for my own reasons. It was convenient. Because if the problem was Harwick, I didn't have to look at the actual problem, which was me being afraid." Something in her face shifted, very slightly. "I told Maisie I wasn't scared," he continued. "That was a lie, not a malicious one. I think I believed it when I said it. But she was right. I do that thing where I go interior when I'm frightened, and I've been doing it since Christmas, and it's not fair to you, and it's not something I'm willing to keep doing." He stopped. He looked at his hands on the table. "I came to this arrangement the way I come to most things, like a transaction. Like if I was reasonable and polite and did my part of the agreement, it would settle into something livable without me having to be in it, without me having to decide anything beyond the practical." "I know," Evelyn said quietly. It wasn't accusatory, just confirmation. I think you've known that from the beginning, he said, and you've been patient with it. More patient than I had any right to expect. He looked up at her. I'm not asking you to change what this is overnight. I'm not capable of that, and I don't think you'd trust it if I said I was. But I'm asking you to know something, clearly, without me hedging around it. She was very still. What you've done here, he said, not the work, not the practical things, though those matter, and I'm grateful for them. What you've done is, you've been real. You've been exactly what you said you'd be in that first letter. An honest person in an honest arrangement, and I've watched you do that every day for 3 months, and I've been... He stopped and made himself say it plainly. I've been falling in how I think about you. Not falling like it's pleasant. Falling like it's something happening to you whether you want it to or not. And I've been fighting it because I don't know how to do this again, and because I was afraid of what it would mean, and because it was easier to let gear be the reason. Evelyn looked at him for a long time. Her hands were on the table, close to the wooden flower, and she was not fidgeting, not looking away, not doing any of the things people do when they're receiving information they don't know what to do with. She was just there, with him in the full attention way she had. You know what I was when I got off that stage, she said. You saw it. Everyone in Harwick saw it. A woman with a patched coat and $30 and nowhere else that made sense to go. She said it without shame, just the record. I knew what I looked like. I knew what you thought when you saw me, because your face isn't as hard to read as you think it is, Caleb. He didn't contradict that. I made myself a promise on the ride out here, she said, that I would not make myself smaller than I am to fit someone else's expectation of what I should be. That if this was going to work, it was going to work because I was actually myself, not because I performed some version of what a mail-order bride was supposed to look like. She paused. And I have been myself. I've been exactly myself every day, even when it would have been easier not to be. Even when I could see you keeping your distance, and it would have been simpler to just fill in less space. I know, he said. So when you tell me you've been watching that and falling in how you think about me... She stopped. She looked at the flower on the table, then back at him. I need to know that what you're responding to is the actual thing, not gratitude for the bread, not Maisie needing a mother, not relief that the house runs better. The actual person. Because I have been as honest as I know how to be. And what I cannot do is be someone's consolation, something that fills a gap where something else used to be. It was the most she'd said at once in a single direction since the conversation about Missouri, and it landed with a precision that made it clear she'd been holding it for a while, not as an accusation, but as a fact she'd needed to keep in reserve until someone gave her reason to say it. He held her gaze. I know the difference, he said. I am not... He stopped, began again. Eleanor was Eleanor. What she was, what she meant to this family, to me, to Maisie. That doesn't go away, and I'm not asking it to, and I don't think you're asking that either. But what I feel when you're in the room is not grief, Evelyn. It's not. It's something else, and it's something that belongs to you specifically, not to the idea of a woman in this house. She breathed. One slow breath. You're sure, she said. I'm sure. She looked at him for another long moment, the measuring look, the one where she was deciding, and then something in her face settled. Not dramatically, not like a door opening, but like a room coming to the right temperature. Something that had been held against a possibility released. Then I'd like to stay, she said. Not as an arrangement. I want to be clear about that, as whatever this becomes. With the understanding that I'm not going to pretend to be something I'm not, and I'm going to tell you when something is wrong, and I'm not going to be grateful in a way that makes me small. I would not want you to be, he said. And you're going to have to actually talk to me, she said. Not go to the back room for a week when something gets difficult. That's fair? I'm serious, Caleb. I know you are. So am I. She looked at him. Then she reached out and picked up the wooden flower again, turned it over in her hands with that careful attention, ran her thumb along the grain of the petals. It's good work, she said again, quietly. I told you it wasn't expert work. I didn't say expert, I said good. She set it down and looked up at him. There's a difference. He nodded slowly. Something in his chest had loosened in a way that felt unfamiliar and not unwelcome, the specific physical sensation of having said a true thing you'd been carrying and having it received. I should go see about the chickens, he said. Maisie's already with the chickens. I know, I should still go. He pushed back his chair and stood. He was almost to the door when she said his name. He stopped, turned. She was sitting at the table with the wooden flower in her hand, and she looked at him with that open expression, the one he'd seen briefly in late February by the firelight, except now she wasn't recovering it and putting the measuring back up. She was just letting it be there. Thank you, she said, for saying it plainly. He nodded once. Then he went out to find his daughter. There was a box at the back of the bedroom closet that he'd put there 2 years ago and not opened since. He knew what was in it. He'd packed it himself the week after Eleanor died, had gone through the house in a methodical and slightly dissociated way, the way you do when you're doing a necessary thing that also happens to be an unbearable thing, and he'd set aside the objects that were important enough to keep but too hard to have out in the open. He'd put them in the box and put the box in the closet and gone back to work. There was a ring in the box. It had been his grandmother's before it was Eleanor's. Small, plain band, gold gone slightly warm with age, with a small inlaid piece of turquoise that his grandmother had chosen herself because she'd said she wanted something the color of a clear sky. Eleanor had worn it every day for 12 years, and when she died, Caleb had put it in the box because he didn't know what else to do with it, and he couldn't look at it without it being like looking at a wound. He opened the closet on the afternoon of that same day, while Evelyn and Maisie were doing the reading lesson at the kitchen table, and the sound of Maisie sounding out words carried faintly through the wall. He crouched down and pulled out the box and set it on the floor and opened it. The ring was there, wrapped in a piece of cloth in the corner. He sat on the floor for a while with the box open in front of him. He wasn't crying. He wasn't sure what he was doing. He was sitting with a box that held the material evidence of one entire life, his first adult life, the one before the grief, the one with Eleanor in it. And he was sitting with the question of what it meant to reach into that box and take something from it and give it to the next life. The one that was beginning in the kitchen on the other side of the wall. It didn't feel like betrayal. He'd been afraid, when he'd first started to allow himself to think about Evelyn clearly, that it would feel like betrayal. It didn't. It felt more like a passing on. Like the ring had already had a life and was waiting to find out if it had another one. Eleanor would have liked Evelyn. He knew that the way you know certain things without being able to explain the knowing. Eleanor had respected people who did what they said and said what they meant and didn't make a production of it. She had liked directness. She had been direct herself. She would have looked at the woman in her kitchen teaching her daughter to read, and she would have made her own assessment and it would have been favorable. And that thought didn't hurt the way he'd expected it to. He took the ring out of the box and closed the box and put it back in the closet. He held the ring in his hand for a moment, this small, warm object, and then he put it in his shirt pocket and went out to the barn to do the evening feeding because the day still had work in it, and work was what you did with the days you had. He didn't say anything that evening. He'd made the decision and the decision was settled, but he wasn't going to rush the saying of it, wasn't going to do it in the middle of an ordinary evening when it would feel rushed. He wanted the right moment, not staged, not prepared, but right in the specific way that some moments are, and others aren't. What he hadn't anticipated was Maisie. She came to him after dinner while Evelyn was washing up, appeared at his elbow at the table where he was reviewing the fence repair notes from the week, and said in a voice that was pitched low enough not to carry to the kitchen, "Are you going to ask her properly?" He looked at his daughter. "What do you mean, properly?" "I mean," Maisie glanced toward the kitchen, then back at him. "You talked to her this morning. I know you did because she looked different at lunch. The way she stands when something good has happened." "You notice a lot of things," Caleb said. "I notice everything," Maisie corrected, without particular pride. "Are you going to ask her to stay? Really stay? Like, permanently?" He picked up his pencil and set it back down. "I'm thinking about how to do that, yes." "You should do it soon," Maisie said seriously, "before she thinks you're changing your mind again." He looked at his daughter. "You know, you are a very demanding 6-year-old. "I know," she said, with Eleanor's complete unself-consciousness. "Are you going to give her anything? You should give her something when you ask. That's how it's supposed to work." "And how do you know how it's supposed to work?" "Mrs. Pelham in town showed me her engagement ring last summer and explained everything," Maisie said. She talked for a long time about it. I remember most of it. Caleb thought about Mrs. Pelham, who was the pastor's wife, and had a well-documented commitment to sharing information whether or not it had been requested, and then thought about the ring in his shirt pocket, which Maisie was currently looking at with 6-year-old X-ray perception. "Is that something in your pocket?" she said. "Eat the rest of your dinner," he said. "I ate my dinner." "Then go read your book." Maisie. She gave him a look that conveyed both satisfaction and impatience, the blend of emotions that was her particular specialty, and retreated to her room with the dignity of someone who has said their piece and is prepared to let events unfold. It happened on the following morning early, before Maisie was up. He'd been awake since before dawn again, not anxiously, just alert in the way he'd been alert these past several days, and he'd gotten up and built the fire and made the coffee and was standing at the window with the first cup when he heard Evelyn's door open. She came out already dressed, same as always, and saw him at the window and came to pour her own coffee and stood nearby, not next to him but in the same general orientation toward the same window, which was their morning habit. The yard was white and still. The sky was the pale, almost colorless blue that came before the full light in early March, when the sun was still low and the world hadn't fully committed to the day. "The color of that sky," she said quietly. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. She was watching the yard with her coffee in both hands, her breath barely visible in the cold air from the window's draft. And her expression was the one she got sometimes in the early morning when she hadn't quite put the day's efficiency on yet. Something softer underneath. Something that was just her looking at a thing she found worth looking at. He reached into his shirt pocket. He held the ring out to her, not on his knee, not with ceremony. He just turned and held it out, flat on his palm, the small, warm gold band with the piece of turquoise that his grandmother had chosen because she'd wanted the color of a clear sky. Evelyn looked at it, then looked at him. "It was my grandmother's," he said, "then Eleanor's. I want it to be yours now, if you'll have it. Not because of the arrangement, because of what I said yesterday. Because I mean it, and I want there to be something in your hand that says I mean it." She was very still. "I'm not asking you to be Eleanor," he said. "I'm not asking you to fill anything or replace anything. I'm asking you to be who you already are, which is the person I'm—" He stopped, found the word, said it. "The person I'm choosing. Not because the winter trapped us together and it was convenient and Maisie needed someone. Because of who you actually are. Every inconvenient, direct, honest part of it." She looked at him for a long moment. He saw her swallow once. "You know I come with nothing," she said. It wasn't an objection. It was the last honest thing she had to put on the table, offering him one final opportunity to see the full picture. "You come with exactly what you've had since Christmas," he said, "which has been enough, more than enough." She reached out and picked up the ring from his palm. She held it and looked at it for a moment. At the turquoise, at the way the pale morning light caught the old gold, and he could see her deciding not whether to say yes, he thought, but whether to let herself have it without apology, without the braced, careful quality she'd been carrying since the moment she'd stepped off that stage and understood what she'd looked like to the man waiting. "Yes," she said. She put the ring on her own hand and then looked up at him. "Yes." He exhaled. Something in his chest that had been wound up since before Christmas, that tight-coiled thing he'd been carrying through months of grief and practicality and fear and stubbornness, released a fraction. Not all the way. Probably never all the way. But enough. He reached out and took her hand, the hand with the ring on it, and held it for a moment. Her hand was warm. "You're going to have to talk to me," she said. "When things are hard, actually talk. I know. I mean it. I know you mean it." She looked at their hands and then at him, and the expression on her face was the most open he'd seen it, unguarded in a way she almost never allowed herself to be. And he thought, this is what she actually looks like. Underneath the capability and the patience and the careful measuring, this is the person. He thought he could look at it for a long time. Behind them, from this direction of the back bedroom, there came the unmistakable sound of a door opening very quietly, and then a small intake of breath that was quickly suppressed, and Caleb said, without turning around, "Maisie, I know you're there." A pause. "I was just getting water," Maisie said, in the voice of someone who was not getting water. "How long have you been standing there?" Evelyn said, releasing his hand, though not quickly. "Not very long," Maisie said, and then, after a brief silence, in a tone that managed to be simultaneously restrained and completely incandescent. "Is she staying?" "She's staying," Caleb said. The sound Maisie made was not quite a word. It was more like what happened when a word was too small for the occasion. She crossed the room in 4 running steps and attached herself to Evelyn's waist with both arms in a manner that nearly took Evelyn off balance. And Evelyn caught her and held on and looked over the top of Maisie's head at Caleb with an expression he didn't have words for. He didn't try to find words. He went to pour himself more coffee and let the morning settle around the 3 of them, the fire burning, the pale blue sky outside turning slowly toward gold, his daughter wrapped around the woman who was going to be his wife, and the particular quality of a day that was ordinary and not ordinary at the same time. So, he went to the back of the closet the next morning and opened the box again. He sat with it longer this time, not with the same weight, not with the same held-breath quality of 2 days before. More like visiting. He looked at the other things in the box. A small photograph, a hair comb with a crack in it, a child's shoe that was Maisie's first walking shoe that Eleanor had kept for reasons sentimental. And he sat with them and let them be what they were. Evidence of a life. Proof of something that had been real. He didn't need to hold it at arm's length anymore. He didn't need to keep the box in the back of the closet like something that would hurt him if he got too close. He closed it up and put it back and stood up and closed the closet door. And that was all right. That was all right. What he had now was a woman in his kitchen who wore his grandmother's ring and was standing at the stove the same way she stood at the stove every morning, and the familiarity of it after only 3 months was already something that he couldn't entirely imagine the house without. The seed catalogs were on the table where he'd left them 2 days ago, and the spring planting was still not done, and there were fence lines to review before the thaw made the ground workable, and Maisie needed new boots, and the right bedroom window had a draft that needed sealing, and the backfield drainage question was still unanswered. There was a great deal to do. There was always a great deal to do. He picked up the catalogs and sat down at the table, and Evelyn turned from the stove and said, without preamble, "The backfield. What's the distance from the creek?" "About 40 yards. Then the drainage should be manageable with a shallow grade. You won't need to ditch it." He looked at her. She was already turned back to the stove. "How do you know about drainage grades?" he said. "My father's farm," she said. "I watched him ruin 2 fields by ignoring drainage and fix a 3rd one by actually thinking about it." "You watched your father run up debts and lose everything," he said, carefully, meaning it as an observation, not a wound. "I also watched him farm for 15 years before the debts," she said. "He wasn't good at money. He was good at the land. I paid attention to the parts that were worth keeping." Caleb sat with that for a moment. Then he turned to the backfield page in the catalog and said, "Show me where you mean." She came to the table and leaned over the catalog and pointed, and they spent the next half hour working through the spring planting plan together, her leaning over the table and him sitting, her finger on the page, and his pencil making notes. And it was practical and prosaic and nothing like anything you'd call romantic. And it was, Caleb thought, exactly right. Exactly what he'd meant when he'd said he was choosing the whole of her, not an idea. Maisie came out for breakfast in her nightgown with her hair wild and stopped when she saw them bent over the catalog together and stood in the doorway with an expression of such transparent satisfaction that Caleb had to look away to keep from smiling. "Breakfast," he said. Maisie came to the table and sat down and looked at the ring on Evelyn's hand with the frank, unsentimental appreciation of someone who has gotten the outcome they worked toward and is now prepared to move on to the next item on the agenda. "When is the wedding?" she said. "Maisie," Caleb started. "It's a reasonable question," Evelyn said. She sat down across from Maisie. "Soon," she said, "when the weather clears." "Can I wear my good dress?" "You should wear your good dress," Evelyn agreed. Maisie nodded with the gravity of someone settling a matter of some importance. Then she picked up her fork and started on her breakfast. And Caleb poured 3 cups of coffee and set 2 of them on the table, and the morning went on. Ordinary and not ordinary, the fire warm, the window showing the slow approach of a Wyoming spring that was not there yet but was coming, the way spring always came out here. Not all at once, not gracefully, but inexorably, because the cold could hold only so long against the turning of the world. The week before the wedding, the weather finally broke. Not all at once. Wyoming didn't do things all at once, and anyone who'd lived there long enough stopped expecting it to. What happened was a gradual concession, the cold loosening its grip a degree at a time over several days, the snow on the south-facing slopes pulling back from the fence posts and revealing the dark earth beneath, the creek at the property's edge running louder than it had in months as snowmelt found its way downhill. The mornings were still cold enough to see your breath, but by midday there was actual warmth in the sun. Real warmth, the kind you could feel through a coat, and Maisie had taken to standing in the yard at noon with her face tilted up to it like she was trying to charge herself for later. Caleb watched the weather change and felt the season turning, and somewhere underneath the practical observations about what the thaw meant for the fence work and the field preparation, he felt something else turning too. Something in the way he moved through the days, something quieter and harder to name than weather. The wedding was set for Sunday, small. Caleb had never been a man for ceremony, and Evelyn had said when they'd talked about it that ceremony for its own sake had never much appealed to her either. What she wanted was something honest and witnessed and real, not an event, but a fact. They'd arranged for Judge Albright, who rode the county circuit and was due through Harwick on the second Sunday of March anyway, to perform the civil ceremony. A handful of people knew. Ed Sutherland, who Caleb had told because Sutherland was the kind of man who deserved to be told things directly rather than finding out through the county grapevine, and the Vetter family, who farmed the land to the east and whose wife, Clara Vetter, had been quietly and consistently kind to Evelyn in the few interactions they'd had when Caleb had brought her to town for supplies. He had not told Franklin Gear. He had not sought anyone's approval for it. That felt, in itself, like a small act of resolution. The night before the wedding, Caleb sat in the workshop after dark with a lantern burning low and did not do any particular work. He sat on the bench and turned a scrap of wood in his hands without shaping it and let his thoughts go where they went, which was, mostly, not to tomorrow, but to the months behind it. He thought about the woman who had stepped off that stage on Christmas Eve with her worn boots and her single suitcase and her completely unbowed spine, and he thought about all the ways he had failed to see her clearly in the beginning and all the incremental ways she had made herself impossible not to see, not through effort or strategy, but through the simple, sustained fact of being who she was. He thought about the curtains that turned out to be blue, the yarrow tea, the letter E going the right direction across Maisie's paper, the night with the Frontier account book and the laugh she'd tried to cover with her hand. He thought about the ring on her finger, his grandmother's ring, and the way she'd put it on herself with a kind of quiet deliberateness that was the most Evelyn thing he'd seen her do. He sat in the workshop until the lanterns started to gutter, and then he put the scrap of wood on the shelf and went inside. The cabin was quiet. Maisie was asleep. Through the door of the right bedroom, Evelyn's bedroom, still, until tomorrow made other arrangements natural, there was no light showing, and he stood in the main room for a moment in the dark and listened to the specific silence of a house that held 3 people, which was different from the silence of a house that held 2, which had been different from the silence of a house that had held 1. He had not noticed the difference until there was something to compare it to. He went to bed and slept better than he had in months. The morning of the wedding was clear and cold and lit with the particular quality of early spring light that made everything look slightly more real than usual, edges sharpened, colors more honest. Caleb did the barn work early and came in to find Maisie already dressed in her good dress. Dark blue wool, white collar, her hair done in 2 plaits that she had done herself with varying success. Sitting at the kitchen table with her hands folded in an attitude of determined patience. "You're up," he said. "I've been up for an hour," she said. "I didn't want to be late." "We're not leaving for 2 hours." "I know. I'm practicing being ready." He washed his hands and face at the basin and heard Evelyn moving in her room, the quiet sounds of someone preparing, and he did not hover around it. He made breakfast for the 3 of them. His own cooking, not hers, which produced results that were adequate rather than good. And he did not feel self-conscious about that this morning, just put the plate in front of Maisie and sat down and ate. Evelyn came out when the food was already on the table. She was wearing a dress he hadn't seen before, dark gray, which he suspected might be the good dress she'd had in the suitcase from Christmas, kept for exactly this kind of occasion. And her hair was pinned differently than usual, more formally, though the word formal was too stiff for what it actually looked like. She looked like herself, just the Sunday version. Maisie looked at her with large, assessing eyes and said, "You look nice." "Thank you," Evelyn said. "So do you. Did you do your own hair?" "Mostly," Maisie said, with honesty that did credit to her. The left plait went wrong twice. "It looks fine," Evelyn said. She sat down at the table and looked at the breakfast Caleb had made and did not comment on the burned edge of the toast, which he appreciated. They ate in the kind of quiet that wasn't uncomfortable, the three of them, in the cabin that had been silent and then had been crowded with adjustment and difficulty and had gradually become something else, a place where the particular sounds of three people living together had settled into a pattern that had its own weight. "Are you nervous?" Maisie asked Evelyn. "A little," Evelyn said. "About what?" Evelyn thought about this. "About things being different after today," she said. "Good different, but still different." Maisie considered this with her characteristic gravity. "I'm not nervous," she reported. "I think it's going to be the same as now, mostly, but with a different name for what it is." Caleb looked at his daughter across the table and felt something that he had no business feeling at a breakfast table while eating toast with a burned edge, and looked away before it could become anything Maisie would ask about. They drove to Harwick in the wagon, the three of them on the bench, Maisie between them with her plaits slightly looser than they'd been an hour ago, and her expression one of ceremonial seriousness. The road was better than it had been in months. Not good, never good this time of year, but passable in a way that felt like the land making a concession. Judge Albright was already at the hotel when they arrived, a compact, dry-humored man of about 60 who had officiated at enough frontier marriages to have developed a professional warmth about the whole business without losing the essential efficiency. He shook Caleb's hand and nodded at Evelyn with the specific respect of someone who understands what it takes to come to a place you've never been and build something from the start. Ed Sutherland was there with his wife Ruth, who had brought flowers from her greenhouse. Actual flowers, small and not elaborate, the kind of thing you kept growing through a Wyoming winter through sheer stubbornness, and who put them in Evelyn's hands without ceremony and just said, "Welcome properly." Clara Vetter was there with her husband, who was a man of few words and considerable goodwill, and the Vetter children, who ranged in age from 4 to 11, and who Maisie had apparently been in communication with by some means Caleb didn't fully understand. It was perhaps 15 people in the hotel's front room, which had been cleared of its usual furniture for the occasion. Not a crowd, just the people who needed to be there. The ceremony itself was 12 minutes. Judge Albright kept it simple because Caleb had asked him to, and because Evelyn had indicated the same preference when she'd been consulted, and because simple, in Albright's experience, was where the real ones tended to happen. He read the legal language and then looked at both of them and said, "Do you have anything you want to say to each other before I finish?" Caleb hadn't prepared anything. He'd thought about it and then decided not to prepare anything, on the same reasoning as the morning in the kitchen 2 weeks ago. Anything prepared would sound like something prepared. He looked at Evelyn and said, "I see you clearly now. I didn't at the start, and I'm sorry for that. But I do now. And what I see is what I'm choosing." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "I came here with nothing I could show anyone. What I had was what I was. And you chose that. I won't forget it." It was not poetry. It wasn't meant to be. It was two people who had learned to say what they meant, saying what they meant, in a hotel room in Harwick, Wyoming, with Ruth Sutherland's greenhouse flowers between them. Albright finished the legal language and the thing was done. And Maisie, who had been standing to Caleb's left with the posture of someone maintaining great decorum under pressure, made a sound that was somewhere between a sigh and a cheer, and then recovered her dignity with impressive speed. It was afterward that gear arrived. Caleb hadn't anticipated that, though later he would think he should have. The county had a way of knowing things, and Gear had a way of positioning himself at the center of things he knew about, not out of malice exactly, but out of the particular vanity of a man who believed his presence at events was a form of endorsement. He came through the hotel door while the small group was still gathered, congratulations still being passed around, the Vetter children being managed at the far end of the room. He came in with Pruitt at his shoulder, as usual, and he took in the scene with the deliberate scan of someone cataloging it. And then he looked at Caleb and Evelyn standing together, and he put on the expression of a man being gracious about something he hadn't been consulted on. "Rowan," he said, "didn't know you were doing this today." "It wasn't a public announcement," Caleb said. Gear's eyes went to Evelyn in her gray dress, to the ring on her hand, to the people around her, and something in his face did a small adjustment. Not retreat exactly, but recalculation. "Well," he said, "congratulations, I suppose. I hope it works out." "I hope it works out," said in the tone of a man who is not entirely sure it will. Caleb felt the thing in his chest that had been warm all morning shift to something harder. He had known, when he decided not to invite Gear, that there might be a version of this. He had not planned what to say in this version. He didn't need to plan it, he just said it. "I want to be clear about something," he said, not loud. The room didn't go entirely quiet, but it went quieter, the way rooms do when one voice takes on a certain quality. "When you were in the barbershop in March, you said some things about my wife." He used the word deliberately, present tense, in front of everyone, and he felt Evelyn beside him go very still. "You talked about worth, about what she was worth based on what she arrived with. I've been thinking about what I should have said then, and didn't." Gear's expression had gone careful. Pruitt had taken a small step backward. "What I should have said was this," Caleb continued. "In 3 months, this woman has run my household with more skill and less complaint than anyone I know. She has taught my daughter to read when I didn't know how to start. She fixed things I hadn't noticed were broken, and stretched supplies I thought were insufficient, and handled a winter that would have flattened most people without once asking for acknowledgement for it. She did all of that while being treated by this town as if the condition she arrived in was a character flaw." He paused. "It wasn't. It was evidence of circumstances. What she is underneath the circumstances is more than I deserve and considerably more than you measured." The room was quiet now. Ruth Sutherland had stopped moving. Clara Vetter was watching with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was pointed in that direction. Gear had the look of a man who has encountered more directness than he expected in a setting where social convention usually protected him from it. "Rowan, I wasn't trying to—" "I know what you were trying to do," Caleb said. "And I know you didn't mean cruelty. But the thing about saying what you said in a room full of people is that it doesn't stay in the room. It goes home with people. It shapes how a town treats someone who has done nothing to deserve the treatment." He let that sit for a moment. "I'm not asking for an apology. I'm just telling you what the actual measure is, so you know where I stand on it." He turned back to the people he'd actually invited to his wedding, and the moment was over, and Gear stood in the doorway for a moment longer before he and Pruitt retreated and the room exhaled. Ed Sutherland came and stood next to Caleb and said, very quietly, "Took you a minute, but you got there." "I'm not fast," Caleb said. "No," Sutherland agreed. "But you're sure, when you get to it." Caleb looked at Evelyn, who had been standing beside him through all of it, and who was now looking at him with the expression he'd seen on the morning he'd held out the ring. That unguarded, open look, the one that was just her, no measurement. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," she said, and then, "Thank you." "You didn't need me to do that." "No," she said. "But it's different when someone does it anyway." He understood that. He understood it in the specific way you understand things that have happened to you too. The difference between being capable of standing alone and having someone choose to stand beside you. They're not the same thing. They never are. They drove home in the afternoon with the sun behind them and Maisie asleep against Evelyn's arm on the wagon bench before they'd gone a mile. Her good dress slightly worse for the day's activities. Her left plait entirely unraveled. Her face in sleep wearing the expression of someone who has successfully executed a complicated plan. Evelyn sat with the child's weight against her and looked at the road ahead, and Caleb drove, and neither of them talked for a while. And the silence was the good kind, the kind that had been earned. "What Sutherland said," Evelyn said eventually, "that you're sure when you get there." "He's known me a long time," Caleb said. "Is it true?" He thought about it. "Mostly," he said. "I get there slow, but when I'm there, I'm there." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the road and the pale afternoon sky above it. "I'm the same," she said. When I was on the stage coming here, I told myself I was doing this practically, that I was too old for anything more than a practical decision, that I'd closed the part of myself that wanted more than practical." She stopped. "I was wrong about that." "How long did it take you to figure that out?" he said. She glanced at him sideways. "The wooden flower," she said. He kept his eyes on the road, but something in his face did what it sometimes did when he was trying not to let her see that she'd landed something. "The flower took you 6 weeks to carve," she said. "I had other things to do." "You carved it in one night, and you'd been thinking about it for 6 weeks," she said. "That's what it looked like to me." He didn't confirm or deny this. Biscuit kept her pace along the ruts, and the afternoon light moved across the snow-patched fields, and Maisie slept on. And Caleb thought about what it meant that this woman had been watching him clearly for the entire time he'd been working so hard to keep his distance, and that she'd held what she saw without using it against him. Just held it and waited with the patience of someone who understood that slow-arriving things were not the same as absent things. He thought that was probably, when you examined it, the thing that had gotten through all the way. Not competence, though she had that. Not strength, though she had that too. The patience of someone who had decided to see him clearly and had kept deciding it even when he wasn't making it easy. That was the thing that had cracked the walls. They came around the bend in the road that brought the ranch property into view, the cabin and the barn, and the fence lines running out across the fields, and Caleb slowed Biscuit to let the picture settle in the way he sometimes did when he'd been away, the reflex of a man who needed to make sure his property was still what he'd left it. What he saw made him pull back on the reins more than he'd intended. Along the south side of the cabin, where the wall faced the most sun and where the snowmelt ran off the roof and fed the ground directly, there were flowers. Not many. Not a garden. 3 or 4 small blooms pushing up through the last thin crust of snow at the cabin's base, their yellow heads tilted toward the afternoon light with the absolute indifference to difficulty that only growing things can manage. He didn't know what they were. Something that had bulbed in the fall, something Eleanor might have planted years ago, and that had waited in the ground through frost and drought and neglect, and was now, apparently, done waiting. Evelyn had gone still beside him. "Are those—" she started. "I don't know what they are," Caleb said. "I didn't plant them." "Eleanor? Maybe. Or they were here before her, I don't know." He sat looking at them. "They've never come up before. Not in 2 years." Evelyn looked at the flowers for a long time. He couldn't see her full expression from his angle, only the profile of it, and what he could see was something careful and open at the same time, the way her face got when something got through the capable exterior to the person underneath. "They waited," she said, finally. It was a simple thing to say. It was the right thing to say. Not a grand statement, not an interpretation loaded with more than it could carry, just the accurate observation. The flowers had been in the ground, and they had waited, and now they were here. Maisie stirred against her arm, not fully awake, making a small sound that was the precursor to waking, and Evelyn shifted slightly to accommodate the movement without disturbing her further. And the 3 of them sat on the wagon bench in front of their home in the late afternoon of an early Wyoming spring with flowers at the cabin wall and the season turning all around them. Caleb thought, later, not that night, which was quiet and ordinary in all the ways that mattered, but some days after, sitting in the workshop with a piece of wood, he was actually shaping this time, a small box for Maisie's letters and reading things. He thought about what he would have said if anyone had asked him at Christmas what he was doing. He would have said, making a practical arrangement for a practical problem. He would have said it and believed it, because it was the only language he had available at the time for a thing he didn't know how to name differently. What he knew now was that the practical arrangement had been a door. A narrow one, not much to look at, the kind that requires some effort to get through. But on the other side of it was something that had no word in the practical vocabulary. Not love, or not only love, but something larger than that. The specific grace of being seen by someone who chose to keep looking, even when what they saw was a man who went interior, when he was frightened and burned the oatmeal, when he was anxious, and had spent 2 years treating his grief like a wall rather than a wound. She had looked at all of that and stayed, not because she had nowhere else to go. That had been true once and was not the organizing principle of their life now. She stayed because she had decided to, because every morning she woke up and decided again that this particular life, with this particular difficult man and his extraordinary daughter in this cabin on the Wyoming frontier, was the life she was choosing. And she would keep choosing it tomorrow, and the day after that, in the cumulative daily way that real commitment works. Not the grand declaration, but the ordinary morning, again and again, adding up to something you couldn't have imagined at the start. That was what nobody told you. That was the thing you had to arrive at yourself, usually the hard way. Love, if that was the word, and Caleb was starting to think it was the word, imprecise as it was, wasn't the feeling. The feeling was just the first signal. Love was the decision to keep going after the feeling had gotten complicated, which it always did, which it had with Eleanor and was doing now with Evelyn in different and specific ways that were hers entirely. The decision made and remade. The choosing. Again. He was slow to arrive at things. He knew that about himself. He didn't think he was going to fundamentally change in that regard, but he was arriving. On a Saturday at the end of March, Clara Vetter came by with her eldest daughter to return a pot she'd borrowed in the fall and stayed for coffee. And while the children were outside and Caleb was working in the barn, Clara and Evelyn sat at the kitchen table and talked in the easy way of two women who have decided they are going to be friends and are working out the practical details of it. Caleb could hear the murmur of voices when he came in to wash up, and he stood at the basin and listened to the sound without being able to make out the words. And he thought, this is what it sounds like when a place is actually lived in. Not maintained. Not held together by one person doing the work of two or three because it has to be done and nobody else will. Lived in. By people who have claims on it and on each other. He dried his hands and went back out because there was more to do and because it was enough to know the sound was there. The flowers by the cabin wall lasted 10 days before a late cold snap took them, the temperature dropping overnight and the last of them going limp and brown by morning. Maisie found them and came to report the fact to Evelyn with the serious expression she used for things she considered worth grieving. "They're gone," she said. "They'll come back next year," Evelyn said. "You don't know that." "No," Evelyn said. "But they came up once. Things that come up once usually come up again." Maisie thought about this. "Because they figured out how," she said. "Something like that," Evelyn said. Caleb was at the table, and he heard this exchange and did not say anything, but he turned it over later. Not the sentiment of it, which was simple enough, but the tone of it. The way Evelyn had said it, not with the forced brightness of someone trying to comfort a child past an unwelcome truth, but with the matter-of-fact authority of someone who had spent enough time with hard winters to know that what looked like an ending usually wasn't. That was the thing she'd carried in with the patched coat and the worn boots and the suitcase that was lighter than it should have been. Not optimism, exactly. Something more earned than that. A knowledge, built from the specific experience of having had things fail and having had to keep going anyway, that the keeping going was not nothing, that it added up, that the ground held what you put into it even when you couldn't see it, and that spring came whether you were ready for it or not. He'd needed to learn that again. He'd known it once, in the way you know things when life is going well enough that you don't need to use the knowledge. He'd forgotten it in the 2 years after Eleanor. He'd been standing in the stopped place, holding the grief like it was something he owed, like moving through it was a kind of disloyalty. Evelyn had not taught him that was wrong. She hadn't tried to teach him anything. She'd just kept going, every day, in front of him, and eventually the accumulated evidence of it had done what evidence does when you finally stop arguing with it. He went to bed that night and lay in the dark beside her. She was already asleep. She slept deeply and without apparent difficulty, which was one of the things he'd learned about her that felt like a gift. And he listened to the cabin sounds, the slight wind in the eaves, the creak of the boards, the distant creek running with snowmelt, and he thought, this is the sound of a life, not a perfect one, not a simple one that had arrived here through grief and fear and stubbornness and the willingness, finally, of two imperfect people to be honest about what they actually wanted. He thought about Maisie asleep in the back room, her reading book on the nightstand, her writing notebook beside it filled with letters going the right direction. He thought about the seed catalogs and the spring planting not yet done, and the fencing that needed work, and the backfield drainage that would require 2 days of labor to address properly. He thought about all of it, and none of it felt like burden. It felt like the specific, dense, imperfect weight of a life that was actually his, that he was actually inside of, that he had come back to after 2 years of standing at the edge of it. That was what fear did when you let it run long enough. It put you at the edge of your own life, made you a watcher instead of a participant. And the terrible thing about that particular kind of fear was that it was so quiet you could go years without knowing it was there, because you were still doing all the tasks, still showing up for all the practical requirements, still being technically present while being actually absent in the way that mattered. He did not intend to go back to the edge. April came in mud and cold rain, and the particular exhausted-looking beauty of a landscape emerging from a long winter, the brown grass and the dark exposed soil and the fence posts standing out starkly against a sky that hadn't decided yet whether it was still winter or had committed to something else. The backfield drainage project happened over 3 days in the first week of April, Caleb digging and Evelyn marking the grade lines with stakes the way she'd explained, and the result being, as far as Caleb could tell in the early going, exactly what she'd predicted it would be. He told her that on the third day, coming in muddy and tired and drinking the coffee she handed him without being asked. "You were right about the grade," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "You knew before we started." "Yes," she said, "but you needed to work it out yourself. You're not the kind of person who takes someone else's word for things." "That's a polite way to say I'm stubborn." "You're careful," she said. "That's different. Stubborn is when you refuse to change your mind. Careful is when you need enough evidence before you do." She poured herself coffee and sat down across from him. "The drainage will need checking after the first hard rain. It might need adjusting." "I know." "I'm not saying you don't know. I'm saying we'll do it together." He held her gaze for a moment. This woman who had figured out, somewhere in the long winter between Christmas and spring, the specific grammar of how he worked and had simply begun to speak it as if she'd always known and was only now letting him see that she knew. "All right," he said. She nodded and drank her coffee and looked out the window at the muddy yard and the muddy field and the fence lines running out across the brown land toward the pale spring sky. And Caleb sat across from her and did the same, and the silence between them was the kind that had nothing missing from it. Maisie came in from school. Clara Vetter had organized an informal school 3 days a week in her own home for the county's younger children, and Maisie had been attending for 2 weeks with the proprietary confidence of a child who already knows more than she pretends to when it suits her, and dropped her things at the door and said, "I read the whole first chapter today. Mrs. Vetter said I read better than the older ones." "Don't get vain about it," Caleb said. "I'm not vain. I'm accurate," Maisie said with Eleanor's precision. Evelyn set a plate of bread and butter on the table, and Maisie sat down and began eating with the systematic focus of a child who has burned through an entire day's worth of energy and needs to replenish. Caleb looked at his daughter and then at his wife, and then out the window at the April afternoon, the light on the muddy field, the sky holding the specific quality of a day that was cold but was not winter anymore, that had made a decision and was following through on it. He thought about what Maisie had said on the morning after his apology to Evelyn, before any of the rest of it. "I need her to not leave. She's here. She's actually here." A 6-year-old naming the thing precisely. The difference between someone going through the motions of presence and someone actually, physically, materially there. In the room. At the table. Watching you read the wrong direction E and knowing which word was going to trip you up on the next line before you got to it. What Maisie had needed, what both of them had needed, if Caleb was honest, wasn't completion. Wasn't someone who filled the shape of what had been lost. What they'd needed was someone new. Someone who brought their own shape and their own weight and their own way of being in a room, and who was willing to be those things fully rather than diminishing themselves to fit an idea of what they should be. That was what Evelyn Hart had offered from the moment she stepped off that stage and told him she could see from his face that she wasn't what he'd imagined and that she'd rather they be honest about it than spend weeks being polite around an obvious thing. She had offered herself. Exactly herself. And it had taken him the whole long winter to understand that this was not a lesser thing than he'd hoped for. It was more. On a Sunday in mid-April, Caleb stood in front of the cabin in the early afternoon and looked at the south wall. The flowers were back. More of them this time. 6 or 7 small yellow heads catching the afternoon sun, pushing up through the ground right at the wall's base, unhurried about it, growing the way things grow when nobody's trying to make them grow faster. Just doing it. Because the ground was ready and the light was there. He stood and looked at them for a long time. Evelyn came out of the cabin behind him and stood beside him and looked at the same thing, and he heard the small sound she made. Not quite a word, something prior to a word. And she didn't say anything else, and neither did he. And Maisie appeared in the doorway a moment later and said, "Oh," in the voice she reserved for things that actually surprised her, which was rarer than it used to be. Then Maisie came down the steps and crouched down in front of the flowers, the way children approach things they want to inspect closely, and studied them with the focused attention that she gave to everything she cared about, which was, increasingly, a great deal. "Will they last?" she asked. "For a while," Evelyn said. "Then after?" "Then after, they'll come back next spring." "Because they figured it out," Maisie said, confirming the earlier conversation's conclusion. "Yes," Evelyn said, "because they figured it out." Caleb stood between the two of them, his daughter crouching in the mud at the flower's edge, and his wife beside him with the afternoon light on her face and the turquoise ring on her hand catching a piece of the sun. And he did not say anything about what he was feeling, because he was not built for announcing it, and because he didn't have to be. Because she already knew. Because this was one of the things they had arrived at together. Over the long winter and the difficult weeks and the morning in the kitchen with a flower carved from white oak. The knowledge that some things did not need to be said because they were already, simply and without question, true. He put his hand out, and she took it. And that was enough. That was more than enough. The mud under their boots, the imperfect fence lines, the backfield still needing work, the endless practical weight of a ranch in spring. All of it was there, and all of it was theirs, and none of it was going to get easier in any permanent way, because that was not how lives worked. Not out here, not anywhere. But they were going to do it together. And they were going to do it as themselves, not performing, not diminished, not reduced to what a hard season or a frightened heart or a town's small judgment had tried to make them. Themselves. Fully. That was the only thing worth building from. That was the only foundation that held. The flowers stood in the afternoon light, and the three of them stood before the cabin that was theirs, and the season kept turning, neither slow nor fast, just steady, the way the honest things always move. Forward.